Tonight, we climb into a world that seems to have no right to exist. High in the Peruvian Andes, where steep green ridges rise like the backs of sleeping giants and clouds drift low across the stone, there stands a city balanced between earth and sky. Machu Picchu does not announce itself gradually. It appears with the force of a revelation. One moment, there is only mountain, mist, and silence. Then, all at once, terraces begin to unfold along the slopes. Walls emerge from the grass, and great blocks of pale granite catch the thin light of morning, as if they have been waiting centuries for a witness. It is a place that unsettles simple explanation. The air is cold. Even when the sun begins to burn through the haze, the cliffs are severe. The ground is restless, tilted, and broken. Rain falls heavily here. Earthquakes have long haunted this spine of the Andes, and yet on this narrow mountain saddle, more than 7,000 feet above sea level, the Incas shaped a settlement of astonishing refinement. They built stairways that seemed to grow from the rock itself. They channeled water with exquisite control. They raised ceremonial spaces with a precision that still startles engineers and archaeologists alike. In every direction, the land seems to resist human permanence. Yet here permanence was attempted anyway. Permanence was. That is the first wonder of Machu Picchu. Not simply that it is beautiful, though it is. Not simply that it is old, though it carries the gravitas of deep time. It is that it exists at all. Modern surveyors, architectural historians, geologists, and excavation teams have all returned to the same core truth. This city was not placed in an easy landscape. It was inserted into one of the most dramatic and improbable environments any pre-modern state ever dared to master. Stratigraphic excavation across the site and in surrounding sectors has shown careful stages of construction and occupation. Lithic analysis has revealed extraordinary skill in the cutting and fitting of stone. Hydrological study has shown that its fountains and drainage were not decorative afterthoughts, but vital systems planned with deep intelligence. Radiocarbon dating has helped narrow the period of occupation, placing the city securely within the late horizon of Inca power. Each scientific tool sharpens the image. None makes the place less miraculous. There is a temptation, when facing a place like this, to speak of mystery as if it means ignorance. But true historical mystery is something finer than that. It begins when evidence is abundant, yet the full human meaning remains elusive. Machu Picchu is mapped, measured, photographed, scanned, and studied. Its stones have been cataloged, its burials examined, its architecture compared, its surrounding ecology reconstructed, and still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Was it above all a royal estate for the Emperor Pachacuti, whose reign transformed the Inca state into an empire? Was it a sacred retreat, a pilgrimage center, a ceremonial observatory, or some weaving together of all three? Why build here, in this place of cloud, precipice, and shining granite? Why abandon it within what now seems a comparatively brief span of time? These are not idle questions. They are the kind that leave the mind answerless, adrift to ponder. The mountain itself seems to encourage that mood. Machu Picchu sits not on a broad plateau, but on a ridge enclosed by dramatic peaks, especially Huayna Picchu, which rises behind the city like a stone guardian. Far below, the Urubamba River loops around the mountain in a tight embrace, its waters churning through the valley floor with relentless force. The jungle presses upward from below. Orchids bloom in hidden corners. Moss clings to stone. The scent of wet earth and grass mingles with the mineral chill of dawn. Condors circle on distant currents. Even in silence, the landscape feels charged, as though the mountains are not merely scenery, but participants. To the Inca, mountains were never inert. Peaks possessed presence. Springs were alive with significance. Rock outcrops could be sacred. Horizon lines mattered. The natural world was not separate from political power or religious life. It was braided into both. When we stand in Machu Picchu, we are not simply looking at ruins in a dramatic setting. We are looking at a deliberate union of landscape and design, of stonework and sacred topography. The city does not conquer the mountain in the way a fortress might. It converses with it. It follows the ridge. It frames the peaks. It turns the raw shape of the land into architecture, and architecture back into cosmology. That may be why first impressions of Machu Picchu remain so powerful even after more than a century of scholarly attention. Many ancient cities impress through scale, others through ornament, military force, or the density of urban life. Machu Picchu works differently. Its drama lies in the fusion of elegance and exposure. The walls are measured, but the surroundings are wild. The terraces are orderly, but the mountains are untamed. The city feels at once intimate and immense. You can imagine footsteps on its stairways, hands against its doorways, water spilling from its fountains. Yet you are never allowed to forget the abyss beyond the walls, the cloud moving over the ridge, the river far below, the enormous silence of the Andes. And that silence can mislead. For the city is not outside history. It was not the dream of an isolated people living beyond the reach of time. It was part of one of the most dynamic political experiments in the pre-modern world. Behind these stones stood administrators, laborers, quarrymen, ritual specialists, road builders, and rulers who commanded vast human effort across a huge and varied empire. The existence of Machu Picchu demands not fantasy, but a serious reckoning with Inca sophistication. Ancient people were not children standing at the threshold of civilization. They were our intellectual equals. They observed the land closely, planned boldly, solved hard problems with the tools available to them, and built with a patience that still humbles modern certainty. So tonight, as darkness gathers beyond the window and the mind begins to loosen its grip on the modern hour, we begin our ascent into this high and haunted place. We will walk where stone meets cloud, where science sharpens wonder rather than erasing it, and where a city improbably endures on the edge of the sky. Machu Picchu should not exist. Its slopes are too steep, its weather too severe, its perch too precarious, and yet it does exist, still holding its silence above the gorge, still asking its old questions, still waiting for us among the myriad terraces and altars of the mountain. In July of 1911, an American historian named Hiram Bingham moved through the Peruvian Andes with a mixture of scholarly ambition and restless expectation. He was not yet searching for Machu Picchu as the world would later remember it. His deeper goal was bound to older questions, to vanished capitals, imperial refuges, and the lingering geography of the last Inca resistance. The Andes, with their folded ridges and hidden valleys, seemed to promise answers to anyone patient enough to climb into them. Bingham arrived not as a lone visionary stepping into untouched wilderness, but as one figure in a much larger human landscape, one that already included farmers, muleteers, local families, and men who knew the mountains by trail, weather, and memory. That distinction matters. The romance of discovery has often preferred the image of a single dramatic reveal, as if history only begins when an outsider recognizes what stands before him. Real discovery is usually slower, messier, and more human than that. It depends on directions given half-casually, on names repeated from one village to another, on trails pointed out by hands that know the ridges, on children walking ahead through brush, on local knowledge that does not announce itself in the language of museums. In the case of Machu Picchu, the mountain had not hidden its stone forever. It had simply remained outside the main gaze of international scholarship. Bingham was traveling in a Peru already alive with both grandeur and difficulty. The country's highlands held the ruins of empire, but also active communities shaped by colonial history, indigenous continuity, labor, poverty, endurance, and agricultural routine. The mountain roads were demanding. Rain could turn paths into slick veins of mud. River crossings were dangerous. Visibility changed with the clouds. To move through this world was to accept uncertainty as a constant companion. Yet uncertainty was also the fuel of expeditionary imagination. Each ridge seemed to conceal another. Each rumor of ancient walls might lead nowhere, or toward something remarkable. When Bingham reached the region near the Urubamba River, the country began to tighten around him. The valley was steep, humid, and enclosed by green slopes that rose with almost theatrical abruptness. Here the Andes did not present themselves as barren heights alone. They were lush, severe, and folded with subtropical life. The river rushed below with the force of a living boundary. On the mountain flanks, terraces and traces of older works could appear and vanish beneath vegetation. The landscape was not empty. It was layered. Time sat close to the surface. Accounts of that journey often dwell on a particular morning, and with good reason. Bingham, guided by local assistance, was led upward toward a ridge where ruins were said to exist. The ascent was not grand in the manner of ceremonial processions. It was practical, damp, and difficult. Brush had to be pushed aside. The path was narrow. The mountain gave little away all at once. There There was no sweeping view from a distance that instantly unveiled the entire city. Instead, revelation came in fragments. A wall here, a terrace there, cut stone where only wild slope had seemed possible. The eye adjusted by degrees, then suddenly understood that these were not random remnants, but parts of an extraordinary whole. What must he have felt in that moment? Not simply triumph, though surely some form of triumph was present. Not simply surprise, though surprise must have been sharp and immediate. Perhaps something closer to disbelief. The sensation of having walked into an argument against ordinary expectation. A few stones on a ridge can be explained away. A terrace can belong to a farm. But when carefully shaped granite begins to emerge in sequence, when stairways, enclosures, and fitted walls reveal deliberate planning across an entire mountain saddle, the mind must rearrange itself. It must accept that a place of major significance has been standing in silence above the valley, enduring rain and root and solitude. Bingham photographed what he saw. He recorded measurements and impressions. He wrote with the heightened energy of a man who sensed that he had come upon something that would reshape both his own life and the broader historical imagination. Yet, even in that charged atmosphere, the city did not present a single simple identity. It did not bear an inscription announcing its function. It did not explain why it had been built here, or why it had fallen quiet. Its stones testified to authority, craftsmanship, and planning, but they did not remove the deeper questions. Discovery did not dissolve mystery. It deepened it. There is a revealing tension in the early descriptions. On one hand, there was the language of astonishment. On the other, there was the discipline of observation. Terraces had to be counted. Structures had to be noted. Architectural forms had to be compared with known Inca patterns. Even in the first flush of excitement, the sight demanded more than wonder. It demanded method. That blend of awe and scrutiny would define much of Machu Picchu's modern story. Later, archaeologists, surveyors, conservators, and historians would bring increasingly sophisticated tools to the work. Yet the essential experience remained unchanged. One arrives as a researcher and leaves with the uncomfortable sense that the mountain has revealed only part of what it knows. The world beyond Peru was especially ready for such a story. Early 20th century audiences were hungry for lost cities, remote ruins, and dramatic encounters with the ancient past. Newspapers, lecture halls, and illustrated magazines could turn a difficult climb into a global narrative almost overnight. A city in the clouds was irresistible. The very setting invited exaggeration. The more inaccessible the ridge seemed, the more powerful the story became. The public imagination has always loved places that appear to have slipped free of time. Machu Picchu entered that imagination at once. Yet beneath the romance stood something more solid and more interesting. This was not merely a picturesque ruin. It was evidence of a state that had planned, organized, and built at extraordinary altitude with remarkable sensitivity to stone, water, and terrain. Even the earliest encounter made that clear. One did not need decades of excavation to see that this was a place of high intention. The walls were too skillfully joined, the layout was too coherent, the setting was too deliberate. The city had been made by people who understood the mountain not as an obstacle alone, but as a medium. That is what gave the first encounter its enduring power. It was not only that Bingham and his companions reached a hidden ridge and saw ancient structures, it was that the structures themselves immediately compelled respect. They stood not as crude remnants of forgotten effort, but as the work of minds and hands operating with confidence, discipline, and vision. The mountain had guarded them, yes, but it had not diminished them. Even beneath grass and moss, the city retained its bearing. So the ascent of 1911 has remained in historical memory, not because it solved Machu Picchu, but because it reopened a conversation that the mountain had been holding in silence. A scholar climbed, local guides led, stone appeared through the green, and a city returned to the wider world. The moment feels cinematic because it was real, because mud, breath, fatigue, and uncertainty all belonged to it, and because at the end of that climb stood something vast enough to transform astonishment into lifelong inquiry. The phrase lost city has clung to Machu Picchu for more than a century, and it is easy to understand why. It suits the mood of the place. It flatters the appetite for drama. It allows the modern imagination to picture stone sleeping beneath jungle until a single dramatic encounter restores it to the world. Yet the truth is more subtle, and in many ways, more profound. Machu Picchu was not lost in the absolute sense. It remained present in the lived geography of the region, known in varying degrees to local people, whose relationship to the land did not require the approval of international scholarship in order to be real. That distinction changes the emotional shape of the story. Instead of a vanished city waiting in total oblivion, we find a place that endured in fragments of memory, in local naming, in agricultural use nearby, in paths that still wound toward the ridge, in the practical knowledge of families living among steep slopes and shifting weather. The mountain did not erase all human connection. It simply filtered who paid attention and who had the power to define significance. A ruin can be visible and still overlooked. It can stand in plain reality while remaining absent from the official maps of prestige and historical authority. This is one of the quieter lessons of archaeology. Discovery is often less about bringing something into existence than about changing the circle of people who are expected to care. Long before museum halls, academic lectures, and glossy photographs, ancient places may continue to matter locally in ways that are modest, practical, even intimate. A terrace can still shape the land. A name can still cling to a ridge. Stones can still be recognized as old without needing to be absorbed into a grand narrative of civilization. Machu Picchu seems to have occupied exactly this kind of in-between state. It was neither fully unknown nor fully integrated into the global historical imagination. The geography helps explain why. The site lies in a part of the Andes where movement is possible, but never casual. Valleys are deep, slopes abrupt, weather unstable. There are routes, but they demand effort. Communities in such landscapes often know their surroundings with a closeness outsiders rarely achieve. Yet that knowledge may remain local because the terrain itself discourages broad circulation. Mountains can preserve memory by isolating it. A place can remain near to those who live under its shadow and distant to everyone else. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were already scattered references and hints that ruins existed in the region. Names appeared in documents. Explorers heard stories. Local residents could point toward ancient remains on ridges and slopes. This does not diminish the drama of the site. If anything, it gives it a richer humanity. Machu Picchu was not sleeping in perfect silence. It was waiting within a network of half-seen awareness, partly remembered, partly used, partly overgrown, and still integrated into the mountain world around it. One can almost feel the difference between local and international vision. To a farmer in the region, a ridge with ancient walls might be remarkable, but not inconceivable. The Andes are filled with remnants of earlier lives. Stone is not automatically miraculous when one lives among old landscapes. To a foreign scholar arriving with maps, questions, and imperial-era ambition, the same ridge could become electrifying. The difference lies not in the stones themselves, but in the frameworks brought to them. One gaze sees continuity, the other sees revelation. There is also a deeper historical irony here. The Inca themselves had inherited and repurposed older sacred landscapes. They did not invent the Andean habit of layering meaning onto mountains, springs, ridges, and built spaces. They entered a world already dense with memory. In that sense, Machu Picchu belonged to a long tradition in which places were rarely empty and almost never mute. Sacred geography does not vanish simply because empires fall. It lingers in pathways, in stories, in rituals altered or reduced, and in the stubborn fact that certain places continue to draw the eye and shape movement. The vegetation that covered much of Machu Picchu also contributed to its peculiar status. Cloud forest growth is patient and relentless. Moss thickens over stone. Roots work into cracks. Grass softens the angles of walls. Trees and shrubs blur lines that were once sharp. Such growth does not erase architecture completely, but it changes how architecture is perceived. A city can become less legible without becoming invisible. It can look less like a coherent settlement and more like a scattering of suggestive remnants. To recognize a place like Machu Picchu for what it truly is requires not only seeing stone, but seeing relationships between stones. It requires enough clearing, enough movement through the site, enough attention to pattern for the full plan to emerge. That is why the myth of total loss is so tempting. Pattern is harder to romanticize than disappearance. Yet pattern is where the deeper wonder lies. The city remained there because the mountain allowed it to remain. Local knowledge persisted because human beings continued to inhabit the surrounding world. Recognition finally expanded Because the early 20th century brought new institutions eager to claim, publish, and narrate. The meeting of those three conditions turned Machu Picchu into an international symbol. None of them alone would have been enough. There's also a moral dimension to the language we choose. To describe Machu Picchu as lost can unintentionally repeat an older habit in which indigenous presence is made invisible unless validated by foreign testimony. The Andes were never an empty stage awaiting rediscovery. They were peopled, cultivated, remembered, and traversed. Quechua-speaking communities carried histories the modern archive often failed to honor. Even when specific details of Inca sites had faded or shifted, the broader intimacy with land remained. The ridge, the valley, the river, the mountain paths all belonged to an inhabited world, and yet the word lost survives because it names something emotionally true, even if historically imprecise. Machu Picchu was lost to certain systems of knowledge, lost to international awareness, lost to the dominant storylines through which modernity sorted significance. In that narrower sense, the word has weight. It captures the astonishment of encountering a masterpiece outside the expected record, but it should be used carefully, with an ear for what it obscures. History becomes more accurate and more dignified when we admit that absence from global attention is not the same as absence from human reality. So Machu Picchu emerges not from oblivion, but from uneven memory. That is a finer and more haunting image, a city high in the clouds, never wholly gone, never wholly present, known by the mountain before it was known by the world. Stones standing above the Urubamba, watched by local eyes, softened by rain, half folded into the green. Not a miracle of resurrection, but a change in who was listening. And once enough, people began to listen. The old ridge found itself recast as one of the great archaeological emblems of the modern age. What first seizes the eye at Machu Picchu is not scale alone, but control. The city does not sprawl. It does not overwhelm through sheer size in the manner of the great lowland capitals. Instead, it compels through order held against danger. The mountain ridge is narrow, the drops severe, the weather unpredictable, and the stone beneath every footstep part of a restless geological world. Yet the builders responded not with crude mass, but with composed intelligence. Every terrace, stair, retaining wall, and shaped block gives the impression of thought disciplined into form. To stand within the site is to understand that the Inca were not simply placing structures on top of a mountain. They were reading the mountain closely, then answering it. The western slope falls away dramatically toward the river valley, while the eastern side breaks toward more rugged heights and green descents. Between those extremes, the city stretches along the saddle with an elegance that appears almost inevitable, as if it had been waiting in the granite long before human hands arrived to reveal it. The sensation is deceptive. Of course, nothing here is accidental. The apparent naturalness of the city is one of its highest achievements. The terraces are often the first architecture to impose themselves fully on the mind. They step down the mountainside in long green bands, their retaining walls rising in layered sequence like the ribs of a colossal living creature. At a distance, these terraces soften the city, giving it a kind of grace. Up close, they reveal ferocious labor. Earth had to be supported, slopes stabilized, water managed, and surfaces made reliable in a place where gravity is always at work. These are not decorative platforms. They are the patient muscular system of the city, holding cultivation, movement, and structural balance in permanent negotiation with the incline. Then there are the walls. Even after weathering, they possess a quiet authority. Granite blocks, some modest and some imposing, were shaped and set with a precision that still seems almost intimate. In the finer sectors, the stones meet one another with such care that the joints appear less like seams than like lines drawn by intention alone. There is no excess here, no craving for visual clutter. The power lies in the fit, in the balance, in the restrained confidence of a civilization that understood stone not only as material, but as language. Through lithic analysis and close study of tool marks, scholars have long recognized that this was skilled work of a very high order, requiring planning, quarrying, transport, dressing, and final placement under conditions that make every achievement more impressive. And always the setting sharpens the effect. A wall in a valley is one thing. A wall perched high above an abyss is another. At Machu Picchu, architecture and exposure constantly intensify one another. A doorway frames not only an interior, but distance. A stairway ascends not only toward another platform, but toward cloud, wind, and the suggestion of sky. The city repeatedly uses the mountain as an extension of itself. It invites the eye outward, then returns it to crafted form. One moment, you are studying the exact angle of a trapezoidal niche. The next, your attention is pulled beyond the stone to a ridge vanishing into mist. The experience is both intimate and vertiginous. It is this relationship between precision and peril that creates the site's unforgettable visual character. Many ruins speak of collapse. Machu Picchu speaks of suspension. It feels held, as if some enormous act of balance is still underway. The granite glows pale silver in weak morning light, then warms toward honey under the sun, then cools again as afternoon cloud drifts over the ridge. Rain darkens the joints. Moss catches in shaded seams. The surfaces respond continually to weather, yet the forms remain steady. That tension between change and endurance gives the city its living quality. It does not feel dead. It feels patient. The ceremonial and elite structures heighten that impression even further. Their stonework is often more refined, their alignments more deliberate, their spaces more concentrated. You begin to see the difference between a city merely built for shelter and a city built to signify. Certain walls do not only enclose, they declare. Certain windows do not only admit light, they direct attention. Certain open courts do not only provide circulation, they stage movement and visibility. The city was meant to be inhabited, certainly, but also experienced. It guided the body through sequences of approach, pause, ascent, threshold, and prospect. In this way, architecture became choreography. One of the most striking aspects of the site is how little separates utility from beauty. The terraces stabilize the slopes, yet create grand visual rhythm. Stairways solve movement, yet lend drama to elevation. Water channels sustain life, yet animate the city with sound and reflection. The line modern thought often draws between engineering and aesthetics seems oddly inadequate here. At Machu Picchu, to solve practical problems beautifully was simply part of building well. That may be one reason the city continues to bewilder modern viewers. We are used to separating categories that the Inca appear to have merged. The mountain air itself contributes to the sense of unreality. Sound carries differently at this altitude. Footsteps on stone seem sharper, then vanish. Wind moves in long, quiet breaths through the grass. The calls of birds arrive from uncertain distances. In the early morning, mist can close around the walls until the city feels reduced to fragments, each staircase and doorway emerging only when you are almost upon it. Then, with the lifting of cloud, the whole ridge opens again, and the geometry of the place returns in full clarity. The site is never entirely fixed in appearance. Atmosphere keeps redrawing it. For those who first came upon it from below, this must have intensified the shock. The mountain reveals slowly. There's no easy, gradual explanation. You climb through vegetation, feel the slope steepen, and then encounter architecture that should not logically be there in such complexity and confidence. The eye must travel repeatedly across the terraces, the walls, the platforms, the temples, as if checking itself. Yes, this is truly a city. Yes, it is held on a ridge. Yes, its makers intended permanence in a landscape that seems built to deny it. The effect is almost moral in its force. It commands respect not only for what was built, but for the thought that preceded the building. This is why Machu Picchu does not merely survive as a beautiful ruin. It survives as an argument. It argues against the old habit of underestimating ancient engineering. It argues against the assumption that elegance belongs only to ease. It argues that hardship and refinement can coexist. Most of all, it argues that human beings, even without iron tools, wheeled transport, or modern machinery, could produce works of astonishing intelligence when sustained by organization, skill, and a clear sense of purpose. So the city continues to stand on its narrow throne above the gorge, terraces descending like measured breaths, walls holding their quiet lines against rain and time. It is a place where stone does not simply remain. It composes, it frames, it steadies. And in that composed steadiness, high over the roaring river and under the moving cloud, Machu Picchu makes its first and perhaps deepest impression. This city was not only built, it was made to belong to the impossible. Mountain landscapes gather stories the way old walls gather lichen. They hold them quietly, layer upon layer, until a ridge is no longer only rock and grass, but memory made visible. Machu Picchu belongs to such a landscape. It is not simply a concentration of stone structures placed in a dramatic setting. It is part of a world in which peaks, rivers, clouds, and carved outcrops were understood to possess character, force, and sacred weight. To walk among these heights is to sense that the city was never meant to stand apart from legend. It was meant to breathe within it. The Andes encourage this kind of thinking even now. Distance behaves strangely here. A mountain that appears near may demand hours of hard climbing. A valley floor that looks calm from above can roar with unseen water and shifting weather. Clouds arrive without ceremony, swallowing ridges and temples in white silence, then vanish just as quickly, revealing every contour again with almost theatrical precision. In such a world, certainty is never fully secure. Shapes appear and disappear. Horizons mislead. Peaks seem to watch. The human mind, meeting such a landscape over generations, does not remain purely practical. It begins to imagine presence in the heights. For the Inca and for the Andean traditions that shaped the world they inherited, this was not naive fantasy. It was cosmology rooted in place. Mountains could be powerful beings. Springs could mark sacred emergence. Strange rocks could become shrines. A peak might serve not only as a landmark, but as a participant in human life, receiving offerings, watching over communities, governing rain, fertility, and fate. The distinction modern language often makes between landscape and belief would have felt too sharp, perhaps even meaningless. The land was not scenery behind life. It was woven into life's deepest structure. This makes Machu Picchu more than an architectural achievement. It becomes a meeting point between imperial ambition and sacred geography. The city's ridgeline position, its relationship to the surrounding peaks, and its carefully shaped ceremonial spaces suggest a place designed not merely for habitation or display, but for contact with a charged world. The mountains around it do not form a random backdrop. They create a kind of stone horizon theater in which every angle carries suggestion. Huayna Picchu rises behind the city with such commanding form that it seems almost impossible to imagine the settlement without it. Other peaks gather farther away, in shifting bands of blue and green. The Urubamba bends below like a living boundary, enclosing the ridge in motion and sound. All of it feels intentional, even where intention belongs first to nature. From this setting, legends naturally grow. Some are old, some are colonial, some are modern inventions shaped by tourism, nationalism, or the hunger for the mysterious. All reveal something about the power of the place. People rarely allow a city like Machu Picchu to remain merely physical. It invites explanation through story because its existence already feels like a story told in stone. Why here? Why this ridge? Why such refinement and such exposure? Even before scholarship provides measured hypotheses, the landscape itself presses the imagination toward mythic answers. One enduring layer of legend gathers around royal presence. Machu Picchu is often imagined as a hidden retreat of the Emperor Pachacuti, the great Inca ruler associated with imperial expansion and monumental building. In that vision, the city becomes a place of chosen elevation, a royal sanctuary where political authority could step into a more sacred register. One can picture noble processions ascending through mountain paths, attendants carrying goods, priests preparing rituals, water flowing through clean stone channels while mist drifted over the terraces. Whether this image captures the full historical reality is another matter. Yet its persistence reveals how naturally the site lends itself to scenes of concentrated power and reverence. Another layer of legend surrounds concealment. Because the city later stood beyond Spanish destruction and colonial reoccupation on the scale seen elsewhere, it became easy to imagine it as a secret refuge, a place withdrawn from history's violence by the mountain itself. The idea has emotional force. It casts the ridge as a kind of protective veil, a sanctuary spared by distance, weather, and terrain. In truth, the reasons for its survival are likely more complex, involving geography, limited colonial interest, shifting routes of movement, and the altered political world after conquest. Yet the older image endures because Machu Picchu feels hidden even when standing in plain sight. Its concealment seems built into its mood. Then there are the quieter legends, the ones not always written down. In mountain societies, memory often travels orally, attached to place names, family recollections, sacred associations, and habitual movement through the land. A path is not just a path if ancestors used it. A spring is not just water if offerings once marked it. A ridge is not just topography if it belongs to a larger moral and spiritual map. Machu Picchu must have lived for generations within such subtle networks of meaning, even when its old imperial identity had faded. The silence of the archive does not mean the silence of human memory. Sometimes the most durable forms of remembrance leave only faint traces in written history. The stones themselves contribute to the legendary atmosphere. Certain carved outcrops seem less like blocks imposed on nature than like natural forms gently persuaded into sacred order. The city repeatedly blurs the line between what was found and what was fashioned. A living rock may become part shrine, part foundation, part symbol. This fusion gives the entire site an almost dreamlike coherence. It is not only built on the mountain, it seems to grow from it. That quality encourages the feeling that the place was destined rather than chosen, revealed rather than engineered. Such impressions are not scientific conclusions, but they matter because they help explain why Machu Picchu grips the imagination with unusual force. Colonial history added another shadow to the legends. Once the Inca world was violently transformed, the surviving remnants of imperial grandeur took on new meanings. Ruins became evidence of loss, but also of endurance. A place like Machu Picchu, remote and elevated, could easily be imagined as the last whisper of a vanished sovereignty, a stone refusal to disappear completely. In later centuries, as national identity and archaeological prestige grew in importance, the city's legend widened again. It became not only an Inca site, but a symbol of Peru, of Andean resilience, of ancient intelligence meeting modern wonder. Still, for all the stories attached to it, Machu Picchu resists final possession by legend. That is part of its greatness. The clouds may wrap it in romance, but the granite remains exacting. The terraces are real engineering. The water channels obey gravity, not fantasy. The ritual spaces align with a world of disciplined belief and state organization. Legend here does not replace evidence. It gathers around evidence, like mist around a peak, shaping perception without wholly obscuring form. That balance is rare. Too much myth, and the site becomes weightless. Too much reduction, and the site loses its human resonance. Machu Picchu lives in the space between, so the city stands where story and stone meet. The mountains around it hold their old authority. The river keeps circling below. Clouds continue to arrive like uninvited thoughts, and the ruins remain suspended in that charged Andean world where every summit can become an ancestor, every spring a threshold, every outcrop a sign. Machu Picchu does not merely inspire legends because it is ancient. It inspires them because it feels native to wonder, because its ridge seems shaped for memory, and because in the high silence of those peaks, history itself begins to speak with the voice of myth. By the time Machu Picchu rose from its ridge of granite and cloud, the Inca state had already learned one of history's hardest lessons. Power in the Andes could not depend on a single landscape. It had to move across deserts, river valleys, punishing highlands, cold grasslands, and forested slopes that dropped toward the Amazonian world. Few empires anywhere have been asked to master such vertical diversity. Fewer still did so without wheeled transport, draft animals suited to heavy hauling on the old world model, or iron tools in the familiar Eurasian sense. And yet the Inca created not a fragile mountain kingdom, but a vast political organism capable of moving labor, goods, ritual obligations, and royal authority across astonishing distances. To understand why Machu Picchu could exist, one must first understand the civilization that made it imaginable. The Inca did not emerge from emptiness. They inherited a long Andean tradition of farming difficult terrain, shaping stone, organizing communities, and treating landscape as both practical resource and sacred order. Earlier societies had already built monumental centers, engineered fields, managed water, and developed systems of labor and hierarchy. The Inca absorbed, adapted, and enlarged these inheritances with remarkable speed. What seems sudden in historical outline was in truth the concentration of many older streams of knowledge. Their heartland lay around Cusco, high in the Andes, where political memory, sacred geography, and dynastic ambition fused into a potent center of power. From there, rulers expanded outward through alliance, conquest, negotiation, intimidation, and administrative invention. This expansion was not random. It had logic. To control the Andes meant controlling corridors of movement, productive valleys, strategic highlands, and ceremonial places that anchored legitimacy. Imperial growth brought not only more land, but more ecological zones into a coordinated system: maize from favored valleys, potatoes from colder elevations, coca from warmer slopes, camelid wool from puna grasslands, and labor from communities bound into state service, all became part of an enormous circulation of wealth and obligation. This was an empire of thin air and deliberate motion. Roads stitched together mountain worlds that might otherwise have remained politically separate. Storage facilities gathered food, textiles, weapons, and tools in anticipation of military campaigns, ritual events, scarcity, or administrative need. State labor obligations drew people into projects that were at once practical and symbolic. From terrace building to road maintenance, from temple service to construction in royal centers, power traveled by foot, by relay, by memory, by architecture, and by the disciplined repetition of duty. A city like Machu Picchu was not the result of isolated genius. It was the visible crest of an entire social machine. What makes the Inca especially striking is that their imperial order was never purely material. It rested on cosmology as much as command. Rulers did not merely govern. They stood within a sacred framework that bound authority to lineage, ritual, and the ordering of the world. To govern well was not simply to collect tribute or defeat enemies. It was to keep relationships intact between people, ancestors, lands, shrines, and divine forces. This is one reason Inca architecture feels so different from the blunt utilitarianism of many later empires. Buildings, roads, terraces, and ritual spaces were not separate categories. They were intertwined expressions of a world in which politics, engineering, and holiness could share the same stone. Machu Picchu belongs fully to that imperial mentality. Its position on a dramatic ridge above the Urubamba was not the choice of a people indifferent to difficulty. It was the choice of a state able to transform difficulty into prestige. Height itself carried meaning. Elevation sharpened visibility, both literal and symbolic. To place a refined settlement in such a location was to declare command over terrain that most societies would avoid. It was also to create a setting in which mountain presence, celestial observation, elite residence, and agricultural control could all be brought into one concentrated statement. The city's apparent remoteness should not mislead us. Inca planners were deeply familiar with connecting difficult places to broader systems, mountain saddles, ridges, and valleys that appear isolated to modern tourists were often integrated into networks of movement and significance. The empire excelled at making the improbable functional. It was not a matter of ignoring topography, but of reading it with unusual intelligence. A ridge could become a route, a slope could become terraces, a sacred outcrop could become a shrine. A difficult environment was not necessarily rejected. It might be selected precisely because challenge amplified meaning. At the human level, such achievements required enormous organization. Quarrying stone in steep terrain demanded labor coordination, technical knowledge, and planning sensitive to weather, fracture, and transport. Agricultural terraces required understanding of drainage, soil depth, slope retention, and crop strategy. Residential and ceremonial sectors had to be arranged with attention to hierarchy, access, and movement. Water had to be captured and directed cleanly. None of this happened through improvisation alone, even where craftsmanship adapted to local conditions in flexible ways. The broader execution suggests a civilization comfortable with long projects, disciplined labor pools, and a clear sense of architectural intention. There is also a psychological dimension to imperial building that should not be overlooked. Great states often create places that embody how they wish to be seen by themselves. Machu Picchu may well have served such a role. It was not the largest Inca center, nor the administrative heart of the empire, but it concentrated values the imperial system prized: order without stiffness, power expressed through stone and setting, intimacy with sacred landscape, mastery of difficult ground, controlled access, elegance in service of authority. Such a place does more than house activity. It dramatizes a worldview, and what a worldview it was. In the Inca vision, the empire was not merely territory. It was a moral and cosmic arrangement linking communities to the ruling center through labor, reciprocity, ritual, and submission. This arrangement could be harsh. It could absorb conquered peoples and redirect their work toward imperial ends. Yet it was never presented as mere extraction. It justified itself through order, abundance, ceremony, and the visible ability of rulers to mediate between human society and the powerful forces embedded in the land. That is the deeper context in which Machu Picchu becomes legible, not as an eccentric mountaintop marvel, but as a refined expression of an empire that believed difficult beauty was one form of truth. When the sun first strikes the terraces there, or when afternoon cloud drifts across the granite walls, one feels the seductive ease of seeing only serenity. But the serenity was built by a civilization of tremendous motion and discipline. Behind every cut stone stood laborers and planners. Behind every terrace stood generations of Andean agricultural intelligence. Behind every ritual platform stood ideas about sacred geography and royal legitimacy. Machu Picchu, for all its grace, is not detached from the machinery of empire. It is one of its most eloquent products. So the city on the ridge should not be imagined as a miracle that appeared outside history. It belongs to the age when the Inca transformed the Andes into an imperial landscape, when roads threaded through mountains, when rulers turned sacred topography into political theater, and when human ambition rose confidently into the thin air. Only in such a world could a place like Machu Picchu come into being. It was born from altitude, organization, and belief, from an empire that looked at difficult mountains and saw not impossibility, but design waiting to be made real. Beneath the grass, beneath the stairways, beneath the polished confidence of imperial stone, Machu Picchu rests on a broken mountain. That fact is among the most important and most astonishing in the story of its construction. To the casual eye, the ridge may appear firm simply because it is dramatic. Granite suggests permanence. Height suggests strength. But geology is rarely so simple. This city was built in earthquake country, in a zone of intense tectonic pressure where the Andean world itself was born through collision, uplift, fracture, and instability. The mountain on which Machu Picchu stands is not a calm pedestal. It is a living product of stress. This is what makes the site's survival so intellectually thrilling. The Inca did not build in ignorance of danger. They built with a practical intimacy born of long experience in unstable terrain. Modern geological studies of the ridge and surrounding bedrock have shown faulting, fractured granite, and structural weaknesses that, at first glance, would seem to argue against major construction. Yet those same conditions also created opportunities. Cracks in the rock made quarrying more manageable. Natural fracture lines offered stone that could be worked and shaped. Fault-bounded topography helped define the very saddle and steep flanks that gave the site its dramatic form. The mountain was hazardous, yes, but it was also usable in ways a more uniform mass might not have been. In other words, the same geology that threatens Machu Picchu may have helped make Machu Picchu possible. That paradox lies close to the heart of Inca engineering. They were not searching for idealized, static perfection in the modern sense. They were reading landscapes as combinations of risk and utility, danger and potential. A broken granite ridge could be understood not only as a problem to avoid, but as a place whose shape, drainage, stone supply, and sacred prominence made it worth the challenge. The builders accepted instability as part of reality and then worked intelligently within it. Earthquakes were an unavoidable fact of Andean life over generations. People living in this world learned by observation what kinds of structures suffered, what kinds endured, and how stone behaved when the earth moved. The finest Inca masonry reflects this accumulated knowledge. Walls often tilt slightly inward. Doorways are frequently trapezoidal, broader at the base and narrower toward the top, helping distribute stress. Stones are fitted without mortar in such a way that they can respond subtly to seismic motion, shifting and settling rather than shattering in brittle collapse. This is not seismic immunity. Nothing built by human hands is immune, but it is seismic wisdom, born from a landscape where survival depended on understanding that the ground itself could turn unpredictable. At Machu Picchu, that wisdom was multiplied by necessity. The ridge is narrow. Slopes plunge sharply. Heavy rain saturates the ground. Water seeks every weakness. In such a setting, a poorly designed city would not merely age badly. It would fail quickly. Walls would bulge. Terraces would slump. Pathways would wash out. Foundations would crack beyond repair. The continued coherence of the site, even after centuries of abandonment, tells us that its builders had an exceptional grasp of structural logic. They were not only setting stones attractively on a scenic ridge, they were stabilizing a mountain. The terraces reveal this as clearly as any ceremonial structure. Seen from afar, They charm the eye with rhythmic beauty. Seen geologically, they are retaining systems of remarkable sophistication. Layer by layer, they hold slopes in check, reducing erosion, distributing weight, and managing the constant downward pull of soil and water. Fill materials were selected and arranged to support drainage. Surface soils suitable for cultivation were only part of the design. Beneath them lay carefully prepared layers that helped water move rather than accumulate. This mattered immensely. On a mountain like this, standing water is not a minor inconvenience. It is an invitation to collapse. The very placement of buildings also suggests a sensitive reading of bedrock and terrain. Structures of higher status and finer masonry tend to occupy especially stable and meaningful zones, where natural rock outcrops could be integrated into the design. Rather than forcing an abstract grid onto the saddle, the city conforms to the mountain's logic. It bends, steps, and anchors itself. Bedrock is embraced where possible, not hidden. Outcrops become part of walls, shrines, or platforms. The result is not only visually powerful, it is structurally prudent. To build with the mountain is often safer than to build against it. Modern researchers have sometimes described the site as an engineering masterpiece precisely because of this marriage between geology and architecture. The achievement does not lie in denying the mountain's fracture, but in exploiting it with extraordinary discipline. Quarry zones near the site show how builders took advantage of available stone. The ridge itself provided the material, reducing the need for impossible long-distance hauling of massive blocks. At the same time, working stone from such terrain required judgment. Fracture lines can offer opportunity, but they can also produce weakness. Selecting, shaping, and placing granite in a seismic setting demanded more than brute effort. It demanded close practical knowledge, repeated over thousands of acts of construction. There is something deeply humbling in that. The modern world often treats geology as the domain of specialized science, as indeed it is. Yet long before formal geological terminology, Andean builders developed a lived geology of their own. They knew where slopes failed. They knew how water moved after heavy rain. They knew which stones split cleanly and which did not. They knew that certain forms endured earthquake motion better than others. Their knowledge was empirical, embodied, and tested by generations. Machu Picchu is one of its highest expressions. The city's beauty can sometimes distract from this severity. Mist drifting through the ruins, llamas moving quietly among the terraces, morning sun warming the granite. All these elements encourage reverie. But beneath the reverie stands a harder truth. This was a place built on instability and made durable through relentless intelligence. The ridge was never generous. It offered stone, prominence, and sacred setting, but demanded constant negotiation in return. Every stair and wall can be understood as part of that negotiation. Perhaps that is why Machu Picchu feels so alive. It is not simply preserved architecture. It is architecture still in conversation with the forces that shaped it. Rain continues to fall. Slopes continue to strain. Earth still holds the memory of movement. And the city, though vulnerable, still answers with terraces, retaining walls, fitted joints, and a layout tuned to the mountain's own broken anatomy. It remains a suspended resolution to a geological challenge. So when we say Machu Picchu should not exist, part of what we mean is this: it should not exist here, on this fault-marked ridge, in this wet and unstable highland, above this turning river, in a land where the ground itself can shudder without warning. Yet the Inca looked at this fractured mountain and saw not only danger, but possibility. They read the breaks in the granite as openings, the steepness as prestige, the instability as a problem to be mastered. Their city was not built despite geology. It was built through geology, by people who understood that even a broken mountain could be taught, for a time, to hold a dream in stone. If stone gave Machu Picchu its bones, water gave it life. On a mountain ridge where rain could nourish and destroy in the same hour, the management of water was not a luxury, nor an ornament added once the grander architecture was complete. It was a condition of survival. Without reliable flow, the city could not sustain its households, its ritual routines, or its cultivated slopes. Without disciplined drainage, the mountain itself would begin to betray the settlement, loosening soil, weakening terraces, and turning pathways into channels of ruin. To build here was to enter into a permanent negotiation with falling water. The first thing to understand is that Machu Picchu lives in a wet world. Many imagine the Andes only as a domain of cold rock and thin air. But this ridge occupies a transitional zone where mountain and cloud forest meet. Moisture gathers easily. Mists drift in. Seasonal rains can be intense. Surfaces remain damp for long stretches. Under such conditions, engineering failure would arrive not only through dramatic catastrophe, but through accumulation. A little trapped water here, a little erosion there, repeated over months and years, could steadily undo the labor of generations. The Inca understood this with startling clarity. At the heart of the city's water system was a spring, or rather a carefully managed source whose flow could be captured and directed. This was one of the site's great gifts. A settlement at such altitude and exposure required a dependable supply not wholly reliant on collecting rain. The spring made concentrated occupation possible, but only if its water could be controlled. From that source, the builders created a sequence of channels and fountains that carried water through the urban core with elegance and precision. The flow did not simply wander where gravity happened to send it. It was guided, staged, and distributed. The famous fountains of Machu Picchu reveal how practical need and aesthetic order could become inseparable. Water descends from one carved basin to another in a measured chain, each point of access shaped with deliberate care. This is hydraulic planning, certainly, but it is also social architecture. A fountain is not just a utility. It is a place where bodies gather, where hierarchy may be reflected in proximity and priority, where movement slows for a moment into attention. The sound of falling water would have threaded through parts of the city as a constant presence, softening stone with motion and sound. In a place of steep edges and concentrated geometry, that sound must have felt almost ceremonial. Modern hydrological studies have repeatedly shown how finely judged this system was. Channel gradients had to be steep enough to maintain flow, but not so steep that the water would damage the works or spill uncontrollably. Basin design had to account for volume, overflow, and durability. Intake management mattered. Maintenance mattered. This was not a casual achievement. It required observation, experimentation, and a very close understanding of how water behaves on mountain terrain. In a sense, every channel at Machu Picchu is a record of intellectual discipline. Yet the fountains, impressive as they are, represent only part of the water story. The more hidden triumph lies in drainage. Cities are often praised for what they display and forgotten for what they conceal. At Machu Picchu, concealment was salvation. Rainwater had to be led away from buildings, from terraces, from circulation routes, and from the broader slope in ways that reduced destructive saturation. The city's builders prepared subsurface layers beneath agricultural terraces using stone and other materials that encouraged percolation and controlled movement. Water could pass downward without turning the terraces into unstable masses. This is one reason so much of the site has endured. Its visible beauty rests on invisible intelligence. The urban sector, too, was shaped with runoff in mind. Stairways, plazas, and walls are all part of a broader conversation about movement, not only of people, but of water, slight slopes, carefully placed openings, and the relationship between constructed surfaces and natural bedrock all mattered. When rain fell hard, the city needed to shed it gracefully. To fail at that task in such a location would have been disastrous. The Inca solution was neither crude ditching nor purely hidden piping in a modern sense. It was a holistic design approach in which the entire city became a water-wise organism. This is where Machu Picchu begins to feel almost impossibly modern in spirit, though not in form. Modern engineers speak of systems thinking, of integrating topography, material, climate, and infrastructure into a coordinated whole. The Inca practiced something very much like this, though shaped by their own tools, cosmology, and labor structures. They did not isolate water management from architecture or architecture from agriculture. They designed the mountain settlement as an interdependent environment. The spring, the channels, the terraces, the retaining walls, the paths, and the ceremonial spaces all belong to one practical logic. There is also a symbolic dimension that should not be ignored. In Andean thought, water was never merely a resource. It was sacred, linked to fertility, life, mountain power, and cosmic order. Springs in particular could carry profound meaning as places of emergence and blessing. to capture water respectfully, to guide it through carved stone, to make it visibly available within a sacred and elite setting, was an act with more than technical significance. It joined necessity to reverence. The city's hydraulic design may therefore have functioned at once as infrastructure and as ritual expression, making visible the controlled generosity of the mountain itself. Imagine the sensory effect. Dawn over the ridge, the air sharp and damp, stone cold beneath bare or sandaled feet, then the clear sound of water descending through the fountains, rhythmic and calm against the wider silence of peaks and ravine, people moving to collect it, wash with it, prepare food, tend spaces, and sustain the routines of life, priests perhaps encountering it in more formal settings, attendants passing along narrow ways. The sound would become part of memory, part of the city's internal time. In many ancient settlements, the most essential systems are also the most emotionally continuous. Water marks the hours. Its control also announced authority. To command water in a difficult place is to demonstrate more than competence. It is to show that the state or ruler can organize labor, knowledge, and sacred legitimacy into tangible order. In this sense, the fountains and drainage of Machu Picchu belong to the politics of empire as much as to daily survival. They say that this city is not an accident perched on a ridge. It is governed. It is provided for. It has been harmonized with the mountain through intelligence and effort. That harmony, of course, was never absolute. Water always remains slightly beyond possession. It can be guided, delayed, divided, and welcomed, but never fully tamed. Perhaps this is another reason Machu Picchu feels so alive. Its systems do not suggest domination in the crude sense. They suggest respectful mastery, a disciplined willingness to work with natural force rather than pretend it can be abolished. The spring feeds the city, the rain tests it, and the stone answers through channels, layers, and slopes. So, when we speak of Machu Picchu as an impossible city, we should remember the quiet miracle of its water, not only the beauty of fountains stepping down through cut stone, but the deeper brilliance of a settlement that learned how to drink from the mountain without letting the mountain dissolve beneath it. In that achievement, hidden under soil and audible in trickling basins, the Inca left one of their clearest signatures. They did not merely build in the clouds. They taught water how to pass through a city of granite and leave it standing. The terraces of Machu Picchu are among the most graceful features of the site, yet grace can be deceptive. From a distance, they seem almost effortless, green ribbons stepping down the mountain in measured calm. They soften the city's harder lines and make the ridge appear cultivated rather than conquered. But the closer one looks, the more these terraces reveal themselves as acts of relentless intelligence. They are not scenic additions laid against the slope for beauty alone. They are structural arguments against gravity, against erosion, against the mountain's constant invitation to collapse. To build a city on a narrow Andean ridge was daring enough. To make that city stable, productive, and enduring required something more exacting. The Inca had to transform steep land into land that could hold soil, shed water, support movement, and in selected places yield crops. The terraces answered all of these needs at once. They were agricultural spaces, retaining systems, and environmental adaptations woven into one. This is why they remain so fascinating to engineers and archaeologists. Their elegance conceals labor, but it also conceals theory. Behind each level lies a deep understanding of slope behavior, moisture, weight, and time. A terrace wall is never only a wall. At Machu Picchu, it is the visible face of a much larger effort taking place beneath the surface. Soil alone cannot simply be piled on a mountainside and trusted to remain. Rain would saturate it, weight would drag it downward. Roots might hold some of it temporarily, but not enough. Over time, the slope would deform, slump, and fail. The Inca solution was layered construction. Beneath the upper soils suitable for cultivation, they placed materials that helped water drain away while also stabilizing the mass above. Larger stones, smaller stones, gravelly material, and finally, fertile soils together formed a terrace body that could breathe with the weather rather than drown in it. This subterranean order is one of the quiet marvels of the site. A visitor sees grass and stone. The mountain sees pressure and flow. The Inca had to think like the mountain. They had to anticipate what would happen after long rains, after seasons of use, after the ceaseless downward pull of saturated earth. The terraces show that they did. They are built not for a single harvest or a single generation, but for continuity. Even now, after abandonment, weathering, and centuries of change, Their logic remains legible. The agricultural question has always drawn special interest. How much food was actually produced on these slopes? Were the terraces meant primarily for subsistence, for elite provisioning, for experimentation, for symbolic display, or for some combination of all these purposes? The answer is unlikely to be simple. Machu Picchu was not a vast agricultural plain. It did not possess the open abundance of Great Valley farmlands. Yet in a place like this, agricultural space carried importance beyond volume alone. Productive terraces made the city more resilient, less dependent on constant outside supply, and more visibly integrated into the living mountain. Even modest cultivation could matter greatly when joined to a larger imperial system of movement and storage. Microclimate also played its part. The Andes do not present one uniform environment. Temperature, moisture, sunlight, and wind can change dramatically with elevation, slope orientation, and time of day. Terraces allowed these variations to be exploited. Some retained warmth differently. Some received longer sun exposure. Some held moisture more effectively than others. In such conditions, careful planting strategy could extend possibilities beyond what the raw slope might suggest. The Inca were skilled observers of environmental nuance. They did not need modern instruments to notice how one patch of mountain differed from the next. Their agriculture emerged from repeated intimate attention. There is also a visual politics to terracing that should not be ignored. Terraces announce labor made permanent. They say that the state has organized hands, time, and knowledge on a scale large enough to reshape nature without erasing it. At Machu Picchu, the terraces are among the first signs that this mountain was not merely occupied, but disciplined. They turn steepness into pattern. They transform danger into sequence. The eye reads them instantly as order. In that sense, they are agricultural, certainly, but they are also ideological. They display the capacity of imperial society to convert hard land into a structured environment fit for both use and admiration. Walking beside them makes this clearer. The retaining walls rise with quiet authority, each course of stone responding to the level above and below. Narrow stairways interrupt them at intervals, binding one elevation to another. The paths force the body to feel verticality in repeated measures. Climbing among the terraces, one understands that they do not merely sit on the mountain. They teach the body how to inhabit slope. They create stages of effort and pause, of ascent and prospect. Looking outward from one terrace level, the valley opens below with unnerving depth. Looking inward, the city rises in layers of masonry and grass. The terraces mediate between human scale and mountain scale. They also mediate between wildness and control. The surrounding peaks remain immense, forested, and only partially governable. Cloud drifts where it wishes. Rain arrives with little warning. Yet the terrace system inserts a human cadence into this untamed setting. Horizontal lines interrupt the mountain's plunge. Geometry enters the landscape without flattening it. This is one reason Machu Picchu feels so composed. Its builders did not try to deny the steepness of the ridge. They translated steepness into a form human society could inhabit. Modern conservation work has only deepened respect for this achievement. Preserving terraces is not simply a matter of protecting beautiful stonework. It means maintaining drainage, managing vegetation, monitoring soil movement, and understanding that the visible wall and the hidden fill behind it belong to one living system. A terrace is healthy or unhealthy as a whole. Once again, Machu Picchu reminds us that ancient engineering was systemic rather than superficial. Its makers were not content to produce impressive facades. They built landscapes that functioned. Yet for all their practicality, the terraces retain an emotional power that exceeds function. In the shifting light of morning and afternoon, they seem almost musical, repeating and varying across the slope like phrases in a measured composition. Green against granite, order against precipice, fertility against bare rock. They give the city much of its tenderness. Without them, Machu Picchu might feel harsher, more strictly ceremonial, more aloof. The terraces bring life to the ridge. They suggest planting, tending, seasonal rhythm, patient labor, and the intimate repetition of daily human care. Even where their original crop patterns remain uncertain in detail, their spirit is unmistakable. They are the city's conversation with growth. So the terraces of Machu Picchu should be understood not as decorative frames for a famous ruin, but as one of its deepest truths. They hold the slope together. They manage water. They create useful ground. They express imperial order. They shape movement and sight. They give beauty to necessity. On this perilous mountain, where gravity waits beneath every footstep. The terraces remain one of the clearest signs that the Inca did not merely endure the Andes. They studied them, answered them, and for a time made the mountain itself consent to human design. A city can be measured by its walls and terraces, but it is only truly understood when we begin to imagine the people moving through it. Machu Picchu was never just stone arranged against a magnificent sky. It was inhabited space, a lived environment of footsteps, breath, labor, routine, ceremony, waiting, and sleep. The mountain may dominate the first impression, yet human presence is what gave the city its pulse. Someone opened doorways at dawn. Someone carried water. Someone swept courts, prepared food, repaired paths, watched the clouds gather, and listened to the sound of the fountains in the cold morning air. Who exactly lived here remains one of the most intriguing questions in the study of Machu Picchu. The site does not fit neatly into the model of a crowded city filled with thousands of permanent residents, nor does it seem to have been a purely ceremonial shell occupied only on rare occasions. The evidence suggests something more selective and more layered, a population composed of attendants, specialists, retainers, ritual personnel, and individuals tied to elite or state functions. This was a place of concentrated importance, not urban sprawl. Its households likely reflected rank, duty, and carefully managed access. That alone changes the mood of the site. A mountaintop settlement of modest but purposeful population feels very different from a sprawling capital. It implies curation. It suggests that not everyone could simply belong here. Space on the ridge was precious. Every structure had to justify itself against terrain, labor cost, and symbolic value. Residential groups were therefore not random accumulations of family dwellings. They were part of a designed social arrangement. Some sectors were finer, more polished, more closely tied to ritual or elite presence. Others were humbler, functional, and more clearly associated with work. Architecture, as so often in the ancient world, became a map of hierarchy. Daily life in such a place would have been shaped first by altitude and terrain. Mornings were likely cold, the air thin enough to sharpen exertion, the light arriving in slow changes as the sun reached over surrounding peaks. Moving across the city meant climbing, descending, balancing, and repeating those motions again and again. This was not flat land where one drifted casually from one quarter to another. The body was always being reminded that it lived on a mountain. Legs carried the memory of stairs. Hands touched stone for balance. Loads had to be borne carefully. Fatigue and rhythm were part of the architecture. Food preparation would have formed one of the quiet centers of life. Fires, storage vessels, grinding, cutting, carrying, serving. Even in a highly ordered site, meals anchor the human day. The people of Machu Picchu did not live on grandeur. They lived on prepared grain, tubers, perhaps maize in valued quantities, and provisions brought through wider imperial networks. The terraces may have offered some cultivation, but the site almost certainly relied in important part on logistical connections beyond the ridge itself. This means that every meal also implied movement elsewhere in the empire. Goods carried over roads, labor organized at distance, and the unseen support of a larger state structure. Water collection and use would have formed another daily pattern. The fountains were not abstract engineering. They were places where hands met cold flow, where vessels were filled, where the necessities of cooking, washing, and tending space turned hydraulic design into lived routine. The sound of water must have become one of the defining features of the settlement's inner life. In the quieter hours, it may have seemed almost like a presence in itself, marking continuity amid changing weather and the solemn stillness of the mountain. The inhabitants were likely diverse in origin. The Inca imperial system often moved people, duties, and identities across great distances. Specialists could be brought in, attendants assigned, and communities tied to state service in ways that complicated simple local belonging. Some who lived at Machu Picchu may have come from regions beyond the immediate valley. Others may have been linked by kinship or obligation to elite households. Some may have served ritual functions, their daily lives shaped not only by practical work, but by calendars of ceremony, offerings, observation, and controlled access to sacred spaces. The city, in this view, becomes a small but highly orchestrated social world. Within that world, not all labor carried the same visibility. Some tasks would have been prestigious, or at least close to prestige. Others would have been repetitive and physically demanding. Stone needs maintenance, Paths need clearing, terraces need tending, water channels need watching, structures need repair, textiles need making, carrying, and storing. Food must be distributed. Spaces of ritual purity may need preparation before formal acts can occur. A city that now appears serene would once have been sustained by countless acts that left little trace in grand architectural descriptions. Ancient splendor always rests on ordinary exertion. There is also the matter of silence, and who was allowed to interrupt it. A place like Machu Picchu was probably not noisy in the way dense market towns or large capitals could be. The ridge imposes a different tempo. Sound carries sharply, then falls away. Voices echo against stone in open air. A gathering in one court may be heard faintly from another. Ceremonial moments would therefore have had unusual acoustic power. A chant, an address, the movement of attendants, the pouring of water, the tread of many feet on stairs, all could briefly transform the city's atmosphere. In quieter intervals, the settlement may have felt almost monastic, though not in the later Christian sense. Ordered, disciplined, and deeply aware of sacred presence, children may have lived there too, though likely not in great crowds. It is difficult to imagine any functioning community entirely without youth, apprentices, or the small rhythms of upbringing. Yet Machu Picchu does not give the impression of a bustling family town. It feels more selective than that, more curated. If children were present, their lives too would have been shaped by hierarchy and expectation, learning movement, duty, respect, and perhaps ritual behavior within an environment where the mountain itself imposed seriousness. Night would have changed the city profoundly. Once the light withdrew from the terraces and the temperature dropped, the ridge would have become a place of sharp stars, deep shadow, and controlled firelight. The surrounding mountains would not disappear. They would become darker masses against the sky, felt as presence rather than seen in detail. Doorways would glow faintly, conversations would narrow, wind would be louder. Those sleeping within the settlement must have sensed both protection and exposure at once. The walls enclosed them, but the cliffs and peaks remained very near. There is something almost dreamlike in imagining human sleep so high above the rushing Urubamba in a city built of granite, suspended between cloud and darkness. This is perhaps the most necessary correction to any overly romantic view of Machu Picchu. It was beautiful, yes. It was refined, certainly. But it was also a workplace, a disciplined community, and a social environment shaped by rank, labor, and imperial intention. People did not come here merely to admire scenery. They came to serve, to reside under obligation, to enact power, to maintain sacred order, and to keep a difficult settlement alive. Their world was not abstractly noble. It was physical, demanding, and structured, and yet that very structure gave Machu Picchu its human depth. Without the people who rose in the cold, climbed the stairs, tended the terraces, carried provisions, guarded thresholds, and performed the city into being each day, the famous stones would be mute. The ruins still hold their outlines, but the households are gone, the voices thinned into silence. We are left to reconstruct them from bones, spaces, where patterns and comparison. Even so, the mountain seems to remember. It remembers that this was once not only an impossible city, but a lived one, where daily life unfolded with discipline and dignity high above the valley floor. Stone was the great language of Inca authority, and at Machu Picchu that language reaches one of its most refined expressions. Not because the city is the largest of Inca creations, nor because every surface is monumental, but because here, stone speaks with unusual clarity. It speaks of discipline. It speaks of hierarchy. It speaks of a civilization that did not treat rock as passive matter to be stacked and endured, but as something that could be persuaded into order, relation, and meaning. To walk among the masonry of Machu Picchu is to move through a world where political power, sacred thought, and technical intelligence have all been translated into granite. The first impression is often one of seamlessness. Blocks meet with such care that the eye searches for the joins and finds them only gradually. Some walls appear almost grown rather than built, as if the mountain itself had chosen to clarify its natural geometry. This impression is strengthened by the color and texture of the granite. In changing light, it can appear silver, pale gold, soft gray, or faintly warm like weathered bone. Moisture darkens it, lichens soften it, yet the essential precision remains. The stone seems at once natural and deliberate, raw and perfected. This tension is part of its power. Lithic analysis and close architectural study have shown that Inca stonework was not a single uniform style, but a range of practices adapted to purpose, material, labor, and status. Machu Picchu displays this clearly. Some sectors are built with more modest fieldstone masonry, functional and effective without extreme refinement. Others, especially those tied to ritual or elite use, rise into a far more exacting level of finish. Here, the faces of stones are carefully shaped, their angles thoughtfully resolved, their joints drawn so close that the wall seems less assembled than composed. Such differences are not accidents of varying workmanship. They are social signals in stone. Refinement marks importance. This is crucial to understanding the site. Stone at Machu Picchu was never merely structural. It was expressive. The effort required to quarry, shape, transport, and fit granite on a mountain ridge was immense. To invest that level of care into certain buildings rather than others was a deliberate choice. It declared that some spaces mattered differently. A finely worked wall did not only hold up a roof, it announced prestige, sacred concentration, and controlled access. It said, without words, that one had entered a zone where the ordinary order of daily life gave way to a higher register of meaning. The shapes of openings reinforce this message. Doorways and niches frequently narrow upward into the familiar trapezoidal form associated with Inca architecture. This shape is often discussed in relation to stability, and rightly so, but it also has visual force. It guides the eye. It creates subtle tension. It makes even an empty doorway feel intentional and composed. Repeated across the site, these forms give Machu Picchu its distinctive rhythm. The city does not present itself through ornate decoration or crowded surfaces. Its beauty lies in proportion, fit, and controlled variation. The architectural grammar is spare, but it is never mute. There is something almost musical in the way the stonework operates. Large masses alternate with smaller elements. Smooth faces meet rougher outcrops. Straight runs of wall are interrupted by doorways, terraces, stairways, and projecting stones that change the pace of perception. A person walking through Machu Picchu does not experience masonry as a single, uninterrupted statement. One experiences phrases, pauses, accents, and returns. A retaining wall steadies the slope. A stairway lifts the body. A doorway narrows the field of motion. A carved outcrop slows attention. The whole city seems arranged to move perception in measured stages. This matters because the Inca did not build in a world where writing in alphabetic script could be carved into public monuments as a routine instrument of state communication. Their power, therefore, needed other durable languages. Road systems were one such language, ceremonial processions were another, textile wealth, labor organization, and sacred geography all played their part. But stone was perhaps the most enduring of all. It materialized authority in forms that could be seen, touched, and remembered. At Machu Picchu, stone says that order has been brought to a dangerous ridge. It says that the mountain has been persuaded into service. It says that this place belongs to people who possess the will and capacity to shape hard matter without vulgar excess. Even the relationship between built stone and natural rock outcrops is eloquent. In many traditions, architecture tries to erase the rawness beneath it. At Machu Picchu, natural rock is often incorporated, framed, or subtly transformed rather than concealed. Outcrops become parts of walls, foundations, shrines, or symbolic forms. This blending makes the site feel deeply Andean. It reflects a worldview in which sacredness inheres not only in what humans create, but in what the mountain already offers. The builder does not always dominate the rock. Sometimes he listens to it, then answers with cuts and joins that preserve its presence while drawing it into human meaning. This is especially apparent in places where carved stone seems to echo surrounding landscape. The city repeatedly creates relationships between shaped forms and natural peaks, between built edges and horizon lines, between crafted surfaces and the older geology from which they came. These are not decorative games. They suggest a deeper principle. Stone could represent mirror and stabilize the sacred order of the world. A carved feature might not simply occupy space. It might refer outward, linking the city's interior logic to the mountains around it. Architecture, in this sense, became a way of thinking with the landscape. The labor behind such work should never be romanticized into invisibility. Granite is unforgiving. It must be quarried, broken, shaped, and placed through repeated physical effort. On a steep ridge, every stage is harder. Bodies strain, Hands repeat motions until skill becomes almost instinctive. Teams coordinate. Knowledge passes through practice. There is no polished serenity at the point of making. There is sweat, impact, adjustment, frustration, and persistence. The quiet perfection we see now is the surviving surface of enormous collective exertion. Ancient elegance often rests upon labor hidden by its own success, and yet success it was. The stonework of Machu Picchu still compels because it makes hard labor appear effortless without denying its seriousness. It is never flamboyant. It does not beg for admiration through sheer excess. Instead, it asks for a slower respect. The more one looks, the more intelligence emerges. A joint resolves unexpectedly. A wall curves in sympathy with terrain. A doorway frames a rise in the land. A niche catches light. A stone outcrop becomes both foundation and sign. The city rewards attention because it was built through attention. This is why the stone language of Machu Picchu continues to feel so alive. It is not simply that the blocks have endured. It is that they still communicate. They tell us that the Inca understood material deeply. They tell us that power can be quiet and exact rather than loud and crude. They tell us that sacred meaning need not depend on crowded ornament. Most of all, they tell us that this mountaintop city was conceived as a place where granite itself could carry intention. So the walls remain, patient under cloud and sunlight, speaking their old speech without words. Each fitted stone holds a decision. Each threshold marks a difference in status, purpose, or mood. Each carefully shaped surface joins the wider argument of the site that human beings, working with discipline and belief, can take the hardest substance a mountain offers and make from it not only shelter or defense, but meaning. At Machu Picchu, stone was never silent. It was the chosen voice of a civilization determined to leave its thought in lasting form. At Machu Picchu, the sky was never merely above. It was part of the architecture. Light entered the city with intention. Horizon lines were not passive edges in the distance, but active boundaries through which power, time, and sacred order could be read. Certain stones were shaped not only to stand, but to orient. Certain spaces were arranged not merely for gathering, but for encounter with the movements of sun and season. This is one of the deepest reasons the site continues to feel so charged. It was built on a mountain, yes, but it was also built toward the heavens. The ceremonial core of Machu Picchu reveals this more clearly than any other part of the city. Here the masonry grows more refined, the spaces more deliberate, the transitions more charged with significance. One senses immediately that this was not ordinary residential ground. Access narrows, angles matter, outcrops are not incidental. The city seems to draw itself inward, concentrating authority into selected forms. It is in these spaces that stone, sky, and ritual likely met most explicitly, creating a sacred environment whose full emotional power can only be partly recovered now. Among the best-known structures is what modern scholarship calls the Temple of the Sun. The name is interpretive, but the building itself leaves little doubt that it was exceptional. Its curved wall is rare and striking, departing from the more angular pattern seen elsewhere across the site. Fine stonework marks it as a place of high status. Openings appear carefully positioned. The structure embraces a natural rock element beneath it, again demonstrating that at Machu Picchu, the sacred was often built not against the mountain, but through it. The result is a place that feels at once architectural and geological, shaped by human intent, while still rooted visibly in the body of the ridge. The sun held special significance in Inca state ideology. Royal power was closely tied to solar associations, and sacred architecture often reflected this bond between celestial order and human authority. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine a simple or naive sun worship detached from broader Andean thought. The heavens were not only objects of reverence, they were systems of relation, of timing, of agricultural necessity, of ritual opportunity, and of imperial symbolism. A place like the Temple of the Sun may therefore have operated on multiple levels at once, as a site of observation, offering, legitimacy, and cosmic orientation. Then there is the Intihuatana, perhaps the most famous carved stone at Machu Picchu and one of its most enigmatic, rising from the bedrock with composed authority. It is not a monument in the blunt sense. It does not overwhelm through size. Its power lies in form, placement, and concentration. The name often given to it suggests a connection to binding or hitching the sun, though such language comes through later interpretation rather than direct Inca explanation. What remains certain is that the stone occupies a position of extraordinary symbolic weight. It appears both natural and altered, mountain and instrument, shrine and statement. The Intihuatana has invited endless speculation because it resists a single easy category. It may have served observational purposes linked to solar movement. It may have functioned in ritual performances whose meanings were social as much as astronomical. It may have helped materialize the idea that power on Earth should align with power above. Perhaps all of these things are true at once. Ancient sacred objects are often diminished when modern minds demand one function only. At Machu Picchu, the richest possibilities lie in overlap. A carved stone can orient the eye, structure a ceremony, embody an idea, and participate in political theology without contradiction. What matters most is the city's broader pattern. The ritual core repeatedly stages contact between built form and celestial experience. Windows direct vision, open courts receive light, horizon lines matter, peaks and sky act not as scenery, but as part of sacred composition. The body moving through these spaces would not simply see the heavens in a general way. It would encounter them through architecture. This is a crucial distinction. Sacred design does not only place people near the sky, it teaches them how to approach it, when to pause, what to face, and how to feel the authority of time made visible. In this sense, Machu Picchu can be understood as a city of alignment, though not in the shallow modern way that sometimes treats every ancient structure as a simple astronomical machine. The Inca were too sophisticated for that reduction. Observation of celestial cycles mattered deeply because it touched agriculture, ritual calendars, royal symbolism, and the broader coordination of society. But the goal was not cold measurement alone. It was participation in a meaningful cosmos. To note where the sun rose, where shadows fell, when light entered a chamber, was to confirm that human order still stood in relation to a larger order. The mountain setting intensified this experience. At lower sites, horizons can be broad and diffuse. Here they are dramatic, broken by peaks, ridges, and shifting cloud. Light arrives in sequences of revelation. One summit catches fire before another. Mist can hide the sky, then open it suddenly. Such conditions make solar observation more than technical. They make it emotional. Dawn is not abstract on a ridge like this. It is a felt event. The mountain changing color, the stone taking warmth, the sacred spaces awakening into definition. A ritual performed under such conditions would have possessed unusual force. It is also worth remembering that sacred architecture at Machu Picchu did not isolate the heavens from the earth beneath. The ceremonial core remains bound to bedrock, to springs, to terraces, to the shaping of the ridge itself. This reflects a wider Andean principle. Sky and earth were not enemies, nor separate domains divided by a rigid line. They formed part of one relational world. The sacred was found in what emerged, flowed, rose, and endured. A temple opening to the sun and rooted in living rock therefore made profound sense. It joined celestial authority to mountain power in one deliberate form. The people admitted into these ceremonial zones would have felt that union physically. They would have climbed toward it, passed through narrowing thresholds, entered spaces where stone surfaces caught light differently, where silence may have deepened, where certain actions were permitted and others forbidden. Ritual is never only what is said or offered. It is how architecture prepares the body to receive meaning. Machu Picchu excels at this preparation. It makes ascent feel significant. It makes arrival feel earned. It makes orientation feel charged. By the time one stands in the ritual core, the mountain itself has already become part of the ceremony. This is why the Sacred Heart of Machu Picchu cannot be reduced to isolated famous features, however impressive they are. The Temple of the Sun matters. The Intihuatana matters. The carefully framed windows and refined masonry matter. But their deepest meaning emerges only when seen as parts of a larger experience, one in which sky, stone, and rulership were brought into deliberate relation. The city did not merely contain sacred places. It was structured to make sacred order visible, so the ritual core remains one of the most haunting parts of the site. Granite shaped with restraint, light arriving with consequence, horizon lines waiting to be read, a carved stone rising like a thought the mountain itself wished to express. Here, perhaps more than anywhere else at Machu Picchu, we sense the full ambition of the builders. They did not only wish to dwell above the valley or command a dramatic ridge. They wished to place human life within a cosmos, to let the movements of the heavens touch stone, and to show that on this high Andean mountain, power could be measured not only in labor and walls, but in the disciplined intimacy between earth and sun. For all its clarity of stone and setting, Machu Picchu still refuses one final label. This is one of the reasons it remains so compelling to historians, archaeologists, and all those who stand among its terraces and feel that the place is speaking, yet not quite plainly. Was it above all a royal estate, a secluded retreat for the emperor and his court, shaped for elite residence amid sacred landscape and imperial theater? Or was it something closer to a sanctuary, a ceremonial center to which select people came not for comfort, but for ritual obligation, pilgrimage, and encounters with a charged world of mountain and sky? The evidence supports both possibilities. That is not a failure of scholarship. It is a sign that the site itself may have been designed to hold multiple meanings at once. The royal estate interpretation has long carried strong weight, and with good reason. During the reign of Pachacuti, the ruler widely associated with the extraordinary expansion of Inca power, elite estates became one means by which authority took material form across the landscape. Such places were not merely private retreats in a modern sense. They were political statements, ritual environments, agricultural centers, and symbols of dynastic prestige. A ruler could project power through land transformed into beauty and order. He could inhabit a place that dramatized his intimacy with sacred geography and his command over labor. Seen in this light, Machu Picchu appears entirely plausible as a royal foundation, a mountain estate where imperial identity was concentrated into stone, water, terraces, and carefully staged views. There is much in the city that suits such an interpretation. The high-quality masonry of certain sectors, the selective scale of occupation, the refined ceremonial spaces, and the difficulty of access all suggest a place not intended for ordinary mass settlement. It feels curated. It feels controlled. The ridge offered seclusion without irrelevance, drama without complete isolation, a ruler associated with expansion, sacred kingship, and architectural ambition could hardly have found a more eloquent stage. Machu Picchu would have allowed imperial power to withdraw from the administrative intensity of Cusco without surrendering dignity or symbolism. It would have placed elite life in a setting where every sunrise, every terrace, every controlled channel of water reinforced the idea that rulership stood in special relation to the natural and sacred world. And yet the sanctuary interpretation also holds deep force. The city's ritual core is too deliberate, its relationship to peaks and celestial order too striking, its atmosphere too charged to be explained by elite leisure alone. Even royal estates in the Inca world were not divorced from religion. Of course, politics and sacred meaning moved together. Still, Machu Picchu seems to intensify this union. The placement of shrines, the treatment of bedrock, the ceremonial pathways, and the concentrated dialogue between architecture and surrounding mountains all suggest a place where ritual was not secondary. It may have been central. The ridge feels prepared for formal acts of encounter, for offerings, observation, and carefully structured movement through sacred space. A sanctuary in the Andes would not necessarily resemble later religious institutions familiar to European thought. It would not have to be separate from residence, agriculture, or rulership in order to be deeply sacred. This is where modern categories begin to strain. We often want a place to be one thing: palace or temple, estate or pilgrimage center, political or religious. The Inca did not organize reality so neatly. For them, sacred geography could legitimize political authority, and political authority could be enacted through sacred building. A ruler's presence might heighten a place's holiness rather than compete with it. A ceremonial center might require elite residence and careful provisioning in order to function fully. Machu Picchu may therefore seem ambiguous only because we are asking it to conform to categories foreign to its makers. The notion of pilgrimage deserves particular attention. A place does not need to host massive crowds to be a meaningful destination. In fact, controlled access may intensify sacred value. The effort of ascent, the narrowing of paths, the drama of arrival, and the layering of thresholds all make Machu Picchu feel like a place one approaches rather than casually enters. This is true even today. The mountain prepares the mind before the city is fully visible. In a ritual context, such preparation could have been immensely powerful. Selected participants, attendants, nobles, priests, or envoys might ascend into an environment where the world of ordinary settlements fell away, and sacred concentration increased with every step. There are also the surrounding paths and associated sites to consider. Machu Picchu was not simply dropped from the sky onto an isolated ridge. It formed part of a wider landscape of routes, stations, and controlled movement. The famous approach through the mountains, even though much transformed by time and modern use, hints at how arrival could itself have been ceremonial. A sanctuary often exists not only in its central shrine, but in the journey that leads toward it. The mountain setting of Machu Picchu makes such a reading especially persuasive. Pilgrimage in this context would not mean anonymous masses. It would mean intentional movement through sacred topography. Still, the royal estate model does not disappear under this pressure. If anything, it deepens. One may begin to suspect that Machu Picchu was powerful precisely because it joined both functions: a royal sanctuary, then a dynastic retreat in which sacred geography, elite residence, and carefully controlled ritual gathered into one. Such a place would fit well within the broader Inca habit of uniting practical governance with cosmological order. The emperor did not stand outside religion. He was entangled in it. To reside in a place like Machu Picchu could itself be a ritual statement, an enactment of rightful relation between ruler, mountain, ancestors, and celestial powers. The city's architecture repeatedly supports this possibility. Residential sectors exist, but they do not dominate the site in a mundane way. Ceremonial features stand out, yet they do not erase the realities of habitation. Agricultural terraces are present, but not on a scale that makes the place feel primarily a farming settlement. Water systems are refined enough for daily life, but also elegant enough for sacred setting. Everything seems doubled, practical and symbolic at once. A stairway is a route and a staged ascent. A fountain is utility and ritual purity. A wall is support and social signal. The whole city resists reduction because it was designed through overlap. There is a further reason why certainty remains elusive. Machu Picchu lacks the kind of direct textual explanation that might settle the debate with a single phrase. No stone inscription announces its official status in terms that satisfy modern scholarly appetite. The city must therefore be read through material culture, spatial organization, comparison with other Inca sites, historical context, and the patient weighing of probabilities. This is a demanding form of knowledge. It gives us strong interpretations, but not complete closure. Perhaps that is appropriate. A place built at the intersection of empire and sacred mountain life may never have had a single simple purpose to declare, and perhaps this is why the debate matters emotionally as much as intellectually. To ask what Machu Picchu was is really to ask how the Inca imagined power itself. Was true authority expressed through withdrawal into a beautiful estate, through ritual encounter with mountains and sky, through selective residence in a place that transformed the ruler into a participant in sacred geography? The answer may be yes to all of these. Machu Picchu suggests an empire in which rule was not simply administrative command from a capital, but performance in landscape, legitimacy in stone, and intimacy with a world believed to be alive. So the city remains poised between definitions, never slipping fully into one. Royal estate, sanctuary, pilgrimage center, sacred retreat. These are our words, useful but incomplete. The mountain city itself says something subtler. It says that the Inca built places where ruling and reverence could meet without contradiction. It says that elite life could be framed by ritual, and that ritual could be strengthened by architectural seclusion and splendor. Most of all, it says that Machu Picchu was not meant to be ordinary in any category. It was meant to gather meanings and hold them high above the valley, where stone, cloud, and imperial imagination could become one disciplined whole. The stones of Machu Picchu are grand enough to command awe on their own. Yet the city becomes more human when we look beyond walls and temples to the people whose bodies once moved within them. Granite preserves architecture. Bone preserves biography. In recent decades, osteological study, isotopic analysis, and genomic research have helped bring the inhabitants of Machu Picchu into clearer focus, though never into perfect clarity. Their names are gone, their voices do not survive, but their remains have yielded traces of diet, origin, labor, and lived experience. Through them, the city becomes less abstract. It becomes a place inhabited by real individuals whose lives were shaped by empire, movement, duty, and the mountain itself. For many years, Early interpretations of the human remains from Machu Picchu reflected the assumptions of their time. Some scholars believed the site housed a population strongly skewed toward women, perhaps a community of chosen attendants connected to ritual service. This idea gained wide circulation because it fit a certain romantic image of the city as a secluded, sacred environment populated by elite female retainers. Later study, however, brought a more careful understanding. Improved analysis of skeletal material complicated that earlier picture, suggesting a population more balanced and diverse than once assumed. This shift matters because it reminds us how much archaeological interpretation can be shaped by desire as much as by evidence. What now emerges is a more nuanced and far more interesting portrait. The population of Machu Picchu appears to have included people of varied backgrounds, likely drawn from different regions within the Inca imperial world. This is exactly what one might expect in a site tied to elite or sacred functions. The Inca state was adept at moving people, assigning roles, and integrating communities into broader administrative and ceremonial systems. Specialists, attendants, retainers, laborers, and ritual personnel could all be relocated or attached to centers of importance. Machu Picchu, rather than being an isolated village of purely local families, seems to fit this imperial pattern of selective and purposeful diversity. Isotopic studies have been especially revealing in this regard. By examining chemical signatures preserved in human tissues, researchers can infer aspects of diet and, in some cases, movement across different ecological zones. The Andes, with their extraordinary vertical diversity, create distinct environmental signatures that can leave detectable traces. Such work suggests that not all the people buried at Machu Picchu spent their whole lives in one small local setting. Some may have come from regions with different foodways and landscapes before becoming part of the community on the ridge. This widens the city's social world considerably. It was not simply a place occupied by whoever happened to live nearby. It was a node within a much larger imperial network of human circulation. Diet offers another window into life there. Food is never only nourishment. It is economy, hierarchy, obligation, and identity made daily. The evidence indicates that the inhabitants of Machu Picchu consumed a diet shaped by both local possibility and broader state provisioning. Maize likely held an important place, not only as staple and prestige crop, but also as part of ritual and elite consumption. Other foods may have included tubers, grains, and animal protein available through imperial systems or nearby environments. Dietary variation may also have reflected status. In a carefully ordered site, not everyone would have eaten exactly the same foods in the same forms or quantities. The body keeps some memory of inequality. Bone also records labor, not with complete narrative detail, but with clues. Repetitive strain, wear, stress patterns, and general physical condition can all hint at the kind of lives people lived. The inhabitants of Machu Picchu almost certainly did not share one uniform existence. Some would have performed physically demanding tasks involving carrying, climbing, maintenance, cultivation, or service. Others may have lived closer to ceremonial or elite functions, their labor different in kind, but still structured by obligation and hierarchy. Even in a place of beauty and prestige, bodies bore the cost of keeping the city alive. Ancient grace never eliminates physical effort. It organizes it. The possibility of migration into Machu Picchu is especially significant because it deepens our sense of the city as an imperial creation. A site populated by people from multiple regions is not only socially complex, it is politically meaningful. It suggests deliberate selection and coordination. Individuals may have arrived with their own local traditions, food memories, dialects, and bodily habits, then entered a highly ordered environment where imperial identity overlaid older affiliations. This does not mean their previous lives disappeared. Rather, it means Machu Picchu may have been a place where different corners of the empire were made to coexist under the authority of sacred landscape and royal design. Genomic data, where preservation and sampling allow, adds yet another layer. Such research is still necessarily careful and bounded, but it has the potential to illuminate broad patterns of relatedness and diversity among ancient populations. At Machu Picchu, this kind of evidence can help test assumptions about whether the inhabitants formed a tightly local community, a kin-bound group, or a more varied population gathered through imperial mechanisms. The broader trend of recent scholarship favors complexity over simplicity. The city was not socially monotonous. It was structured, selective, and likely composed of people whose life histories did not all begin on the same mountainside. Death and burial also teach us something about belonging. To be buried in a place is to be claimed by it in a final way. even if one arrived there only later in life. The burial assemblages at Machu Picchu indicate sustained occupation, and a community with enough continuity to create local patterns of death as well as life. These were not just temporary visitors passing through a ceremonial shell. People lived here long enough to age, labor, suffer, and die. The ridge held not only architecture but memory, not only ritual movement but human loss. A city becomes more real when we remember that some of its inhabitants never descended again. There is a quiet poignancy in this scientific recovery of forgotten lives. The great walls and terraces have long dominated the public imagination, but the people behind them remained for many years strangely blurred, reduced to generalized labels. Osteology and bioarchaeology have begun to change that, not by restoring names or individual biographies in full, which remain beyond our reach, but by giving back texture. A person may have come from elsewhere. A person may have eaten differently in youth than in adulthood. A person may have carried heavy loads. A person may have belonged to an imperial project larger than any one household. The mountain city was made not only by anonymous labor in the abstract, but by human beings whose bodies absorbed the cost of empire and place. This evidence also helps guard us against overly romantic visions of Machu Picchu as a serene and static paradise. It was a beautiful environment, yes, but also a demanding one. People climbed daily in thin air. They worked on slopes. They maintained systems whose failure could have serious consequences. They lived within hierarchy, service, and ritual obligation. Some may have enjoyed proximity to power. Others may simply have endured the terms under which power organized their lives. The bones do not allow us to forget this. They return weight to the human story. And yet, there is dignity in that return. To study the remains from Machu Picchu is not only to measure strain or detect mobility. It is to recognize that this city was a meeting place of lives shaped by intelligence, adaptation, and imperial ambition. The people buried there were not shadows. They were participants in one of the most remarkable architectural and sacred experiments in the ancient Americas. They ate, labored, ascended stairways, listened to water, watched light move across granite, and became part of the city's silence when their lives ended. So Machu Picchu begins to change in our imagination once again. It is no longer only a city of walls and sky, nor only a problem of architecture and purpose. It becomes a place of human origins carried inward from across the empire, of bodies marked by duty, of diets shaped by rank and movement, of deaths that anchored belonging on the ridge. Through bone, chemistry, and the patient sciences of human remains, the mountain city yields one of its most intimate truths. It was not inhabited by symbols. It was inhabited by people. No city in the Andes could endure on beauty alone, however refined its temples, however disciplined its terraces, however perfectly its fountains sang through carved stone. Machu Picchu still depended on connection. Food had to arrive. People had to move in and out. Messages had to travel. Ritual life required approach as much as arrival. A mountaintop settlement may seem isolated when seen through modern eyes, wrapped in cloud and poised above a roaring river. But the Inca did not build such places as disconnected marvels. They built them as nodes within a larger imperial landscape, linked by roads, paths, bridges, and systems of movement so disciplined that even the steepest mountains could be turned into corridors of power. This wider network is one of the great achievements of Inca civilization, across deserts, puna grasslands, ravines, and high passes. The state maintained a road system of extraordinary reach. It was not a single smooth highway in the modern sense, but a coordinated web adjusted constantly to terrain. In one region, the road might stretch in broad, dry lines across open land. In another, it would narrow into stair-cut slopes and ridge-hugging paths. Elsewhere, it would descend toward river crossings and rise again through forests or cold heights. What united these routes was not uniform appearance, but imperial intention. The roads made geography governable. Machu Picchu belongs within that logic. Its dramatic setting can tempt the imagination toward fantasies of seclusion. But seclusion is not the same as inaccessibility. The city was difficult to reach. Yes, yet difficulty itself may have been part of its meaning. Inca movement was never only about convenience. The experience of approach could reinforce hierarchy, sacred expectation, and the sense that one was entering a place set apart from ordinary life. A mountain path can be practical and ceremonial at once. It can carry supplies on one day and ritual participants on another. It can serve empire and sanctity in the same sequence of stones. The trails associated with Machu Picchu reveal this layered purpose beautifully. Narrow routes wind through shifting elevations, opening and closing views in carefully paced ways. There are moments of concealment, where the mountain holds back the full revelation of the ridge, and moments of sudden opening, where walls, terraces, or distant peaks appear with heightened force. Such movement is not merely functional. It stages arrival. The body climbs, tires, adapts to thin air, and becomes increasingly aware that the destination is not just another settlement in a valley floor. It is something set above, something that must be earned through ascent. This experience would have mattered deeply in the Inca world. Roads were not neutral infrastructure. They were instruments of statecraft. Armies marched on them. Labor moved along them. Officials inspected through them. Goods passed over them. Sacred objects and living participants alike used them in ceremonial motion. Relay runners carried messages through the network with astonishing speed, linking distant regions through human endurance and precise organization. The road system was therefore not merely a convenience. It was one of the main ways empire became real from one landscape to another. To be connected to the roads was to be connected to power. Machu Picchu's connection to this broader network suggests that its role exceeded simple scenic retreat. A true imperial estate or sacred center had to be reachable within a system of planning. It had to receive support. It had to fit into the routes by which the state circulated people and resources. This does not mean supply was easy. Carrying goods in the Andes always demanded effort, coordination, and physical endurance. But difficulty was precisely what the Inca knew how to organize. Llamas could carry some loads, though not the largest building stones. Human portage remained crucial. Storehouses elsewhere in the system helped stabilize supply. Roads and way stations extended the reach of the state into landscapes that would have defeated less disciplined political systems. The Urubamba region sharpened these challenges. Deep river bends, steep mountain flanks, and changing weather made the terrain demanding even by Andean standards. Yet this same terrain also offered strategic value. Control of such corridors meant more than access to a single site. It meant influence over movement between ecological zones, over routes linking the highlands to warmer valleys, over spaces where imperial presence could be asserted through architecture and infrastructure. Machu Picchu, positioned above the river's looping path, did not float free of geography. It occupied geography with deliberate intelligence. Bridges must also be part of the story, even when the specific structures nearest the site do not survive in full clarity. Across the Andes, the Inca mastered suspension bridges and other methods of crossing difficult terrain. Such crossings were feats of maintenance as much as construction. Fiber bridges needed regular renewal, and the communities responsible for them were part of the same labor logic that sustained roads, terraces, and state facilities. A route was only as strong as its most vulnerable crossing. This means that the road system was not a static legacy of one generation's building, but a living obligation constantly renewed through organized work. Approach to Machu Picchu likely involved not only physical movement, but changes in social atmosphere. Those ascending toward the site may have passed through checkpoints, pauses, or transitional spaces where access narrowed and purpose became more formal. This is another reason the sanctuary reading of the city remains so persuasive. Pilgrimage and controlled entry often rely on route design. The road teaches the traveler how to feel before the destination is reached. Fatigue strips away distraction. Altitude sharpens awareness. The mountain removes casualness. By the time one arrives, the body has already been prepared for significance, even in purely practical terms. The site's connection to roads reveals something essential about Inca confidence. Most societies would have looked at such terrain and treated it as boundary. The Inca often treated it as medium. Mountains did not merely obstruct movement. They provided ridges to follow, passes to master, and heights from which symbolic authority could be projected. This does not mean the terrain was easy. It means the state had developed a culture of movement equal to its demands. The roads through the clouds were not luxuries. They were one of the foundations of imperial thought. There's also a poetic dimension to such routes that should not be ignored. Paths in the Andes do more than connect one point to another. They reveal landscape gradually. They force a traveler into repeated acts of attention. Each turn offers a new relation between body and mountain, between effort and prospect. In a place like Machu Picchu, that gradual revelation becomes part of the city's meaning. It is not only the ridge that impresses, It is the journey that has educated the senses to receive it. The road is therefore part of the monument. Without approach, the city would lose some of its power. Modern visitors often experience a fragment of this truth, even though the historical context has changed entirely. To arrive after walking through mountain paths is to understand the site differently than if one imagined it only as a static image in a book. The Inca knew this in their own way. They built not only destinations, but experiences of movement. They understood that sacred and political meaning could be intensified through controlled access, dramatic approach, and the disciplined use of difficult topography. So Machu Picchu must be imagined not as a lonely jewel abandoned in the clouds, but as a place threaded into a wider empire by roads of stone, earth, memory, and obligation. Messages moved toward it. Provisions climbed toward it. Selected people approached it with purpose. The mountain city stood apart, certainly, but never fully alone. Its terraces, temples, and houses were supported by the wider choreography of imperial movement. Through those roads, the Andes themselves were made legible to power. And in that larger choreography lies another reason the city still unsettles us. It asks us to imagine an empire that did not shrink from severe landscapes, but taught itself to move through them with patience and authority. It asks us to see roads not as simple lines of transport, but as instruments of meaning. Most of all, it reminds us that Machu Picchu, for all its silence now, once listened constantly for footsteps coming up through the mountain air, along the paths that joined it, to the vast and disciplined world of the Inca. Empires rarely fall all at once. They fracture in the mind before they collapse in stone. By the time the world around Machu Picchu began to change irrevocably, the Inca state had already entered one of history's cruelest intervals, when legitimacy, disease, ambition, and foreign intrusion collided with devastating force. The mountain city still stood in its high silence. Water still moved through its channels. Terraces still held the slope. Paths still wound toward the ridge. Yet beyond its granite calm, the imperial order that had made such a place possible was beginning to tremble. The first tremors were not necessarily visible in a single dramatic event. They came through wider instability, through succession struggles, through the strain of holding a vast and varied empire together, and through the arrival of forces no Andean political tradition had prepared for in full. The Inca state was formidable, but it was also young by imperial standards. Its expansion had been rapid. Its systems of labor, authority, and sacred kingship were powerful, yet those very systems depended heavily on cohesion at the top. When that cohesion cracked, the empire's strength could become vulnerability. One of the most damaging blows came through civil war. The contest between rival claimants to power was not merely a family disagreement dressed in royal clothing. It was a conflict capable of tearing through the political and ritual fabric of the state itself. In a world where rulership carried sacred meaning, division at the summit could spread uncertainty through every layer beneath it. Allegiances shifted, command structures strained. Communities already integrated into imperial systems of labor and tribute found themselves pulled into competing currents. What had once seemed like a unified order began to splinter into uncertainty. For a place like Machu Picchu, this kind of imperial fracture mattered deeply, even if no enemy army ever marched directly through its courts. The city depended on a larger structure of support, movement, and meaning. Food, personnel, maintenance, and symbolic significance all flowed from the wider life of the empire. If the political center weakened, peripheral or selective sites would inevitably feel the consequences, not always through immediate destruction, but through thinning support, altered priorities, disrupted roads, and the gradual erosion of whatever network had once sustained them so elegantly. Then came the Spaniards. Their arrival did not simply add another opponent to an already unstable landscape. It introduced a radically different mode of conquest, one combining opportunism, violence, alliance-making, religious aggression, and a ruthless willingness to exploit indigenous divisions. The Spanish forces themselves were small by comparison with the great populations and armies of the Andes, yet their power lay partly in timing. They entered a world already wounded by internal conflict and by epidemic disease that had spread faster than direct colonial control. The shock they delivered was magnified by conditions they had not created alone, but were quick to weaponize. Disease may have been even more destructive in some respects than the sword. Epidemics moved ahead of imperial encounter, weakening populations, unsettling dynastic succession, and damaging the continuity of knowledge and labor on which Inca governance depended. A civilization can survive military defeat and still recover if its social and biological foundations remain strong enough. But epidemic loss reaches into households, inheritance, memory, and morale. It hollows out the living body of society. For Machu Picchu, even if the city itself remained physically untouched in the early phases, the wider world on which it depended was being altered at a depth no terrace wall could resist. There is something especially haunting in imagining the mountain city during this period. Perhaps life on the ridge continued for a time with outward dignity. Water still ran. Ritual may still have been performed. Attendants may still have climbed the stairs at dawn and moved through familiar tasks. Yet news must have traveled along the roads. Rumors, reports, absences, disruptions in expected supplies, changes in who arrived and who did not. The city could not remain mentally isolated from imperial crisis any more than the body can ignore a wound in the heart. Even in stillness, the mountain would have begun to feel the approach of a different age. The geography of Machu Picchu may have offered temporary insulation. It was not a major administrative capital in the way Cusco was. It did not stand at the center of colonial desire like regions rich in visible wealth and dense population. Its ridge could protect it from immediate attention. But insulation is not the same as security. A place built for selective residence and sacred significance can become vulnerable very quickly, once the political and ritual order that justifies it begins to fail. Such places often depend less on brute defense than on continuity of meaning. When meaning fractures, abandonment can begin before walls are ever attacked. The Inca world that had once made mountains legible through roads, labor, and ritual was being rewritten. Spanish invasion did not simply remove one ruler and install another. It attacked the very grammar of legitimacy. Temples could be desacralized, sacred lineages disrupted, administrative systems broken or repurposed, local communities pulled into new forms of service. Even those places not directly occupied by colonizers entered a changed horizon. The certainty that had once animated imperial building dissolved into improvisation, fear, and difficult choices about survival. One must also remember that collapse is never experienced evenly. Some communities resist longer. Some adapt. Some negotiate. Some withdraw. Some sacred places retain power in altered forms. Others lose population quickly. Machu Picchu may well have inhabited this ambiguous zone for a time, neither instantly deserted nor fully secure. A place where the old order still lingered in architecture and habit, even as the larger world no longer guaranteed its future. The mountain city was too refined, too specialized, and too dependent on broader systems to remain untouched by continental transformation. What makes this phase so emotionally powerful is that Machu Picchu itself still gives no easy visual sign of the crisis. The terraces remain composed, the temples remain elegant, the fountains retain their measured descent. Nothing in the stone alone tells you that an empire was entering its mortal struggle. This is often true of historical catastrophe. Buildings may stand serene while the society that animated them unravels in fear, ambition, and disease. The silence of ruins can mislead us into imagining a dignified and orderly fading. The lived experience was almost certainly harsher, more uncertain, and more painfully human. The Civil War, the epidemics, and the Spanish advance together formed not one blow, but a storm of overlapping pressures. Each weakened the conditions necessary for a place like Machu Picchu to endure as intended. Royal association became unstable if royalty itself was contested. Pilgrimage or ritual concentration became harder if roads and loyalties were insecure. Provisioning became uncertain if labor systems frayed. Sacred confidence faltered when invasion and disease suggested that the old protections no longer held. A city designed to embody harmony between ruler, mountain, and cosmos could not remain unchanged when all three relationships were thrown into doubt. So the storm over the empire was not only political, it was existential. It asked whether the Inca world could still imagine itself as coherent. For Machu Picchu, perched above the Urubamba in all its impossible composure, that question may have arrived first as a whisper and then as a gathering darkness. The ridge did not crumble. The granite did not suddenly fail. But the human order that gave the city purpose was beginning to thin. And in that thinning lay the first real shadow of departure. Why was Machu Picchu abandoned? Few questions about the city carry more quiet force than this one. The walls still hold. The terraces still step down the mountain with composed intelligence. The fountains still trace the logic of water through stone. Nothing about the site suggests a sudden engineering failure so complete that human life became impossible overnight. The city did not collapse into the gorge. It did not burn into oblivion. Instead, it seems to have slipped out of use, passed from inhabited significance into deepening silence. That kind of ending is often harder to understand than destruction. Ruin by violence leaves scars. Abandonment leaves absences. The first thing to say is that no single cause fully satisfies the evidence. Machu Picchu likely faded from active life through a convergence of pressures rather than one decisive catastrophe. This is often true of ancient places. Human settlements usually endure hardship if the larger system supporting them remains intact. But when multiple forms of instability arrive together, even a beautifully designed and symbolically powerful place can become difficult to justify, difficult to maintain, and difficult to inhabit. The question is not only what went wrong at Machu Picchu itself, it is what changed in the world around it so profoundly that the city ceased to make sense in the way it once had. Political rupture is the strongest starting point. If Machu Picchu was tied in any important degree to royal presence, dynastic prestige, or carefully managed ceremonial life, then the disintegration of imperial authority would have struck at the heart of its purpose. A royal estate without a stable royal order becomes vulnerable very quickly. A sacred retreat linked to elite ideology becomes harder to sustain when that ideology is wounded by civil war, contested succession, epidemic loss, and foreign invasion. The city may not have needed to be attacked in order to lose the conditions that justified its occupation. It may simply have outlived the coherence of the world that created it. This does not mean the site was empty the moment political crisis began. Places rarely die so neatly. More likely, there was a period of thinning, a gradual reduction in support, activity, and certainty. Fewer people may have arrived. Supplies may have become more irregular. Ritual routines may have narrowed, changed, or ceased. Buildings may still have stood in good order while their inner life diminished. A city designed for selective and structured occupation could become strangely fragile under such conditions. It did not have the broad, self-sustaining momentum of a vast market center. It relied on intention. When intention failed, the mountain would have begun to reclaim its advantage. Disease may have played a powerful role in that failure. Epidemics damaged the Andes not only through death, but through interruption of transmission. Skills are passed through people. Rituals are maintained by people. Roads are kept open by people. Agricultural routines, food provisioning, and systems of obligation all depend on enough living bodies remaining in relation to one another. If the communities connected to Machu Picchu lost population or stability, then the city's continued operation would have become harder even without direct military threat. Epidemic loss can hollow out a sacred and logistical system from within. Logistics matter more here than romance sometimes allows. Machu Picchu, for all its local terraces and water supply, was never fully self-sufficient in the narrow sense. It stood within a network of imperial movement, food, attendants, specialists, materials, and social legitimacy all flowed through wider routes of connection. If those routes became unsafe, politically confused, or less worth maintaining, the city's practical viability would decline. Every remote but refined settlement lives by the strength of the threads connecting it to other places. Once those threads fray, remoteness changes from prestige to burden. There's also the question of changing sacred geography. Religious life is not static. When empires fracture, the places that once concentrated holiness can lose or transform their status. A shrine may remain sacred locally while ceasing to function within a larger state ritual system. A royal sanctuary may become inaccessible not in the physical sense, but in the ideological sense. The old meanings no longer summon the same obedience. The offerings stop. The authorized bodies no longer climb the stairs. The mountain remains powerful, but the pattern of human response changes. Machu Picchu may have suffered precisely this kind of transition. Not desacralization in an absolute sense, but a loosening of the specific sacred framework that had once made it central. Spanish expansion sharpened these pressures even when direct occupation of the site itself remained limited or absent. The colonial order redirected labor, attention, and survival strategies throughout the Andes. Communities had to navigate new demands, new dangers, and new centers of authority. Under such conditions, maintaining a specialized mountaintop settlement linked to a broken imperial past may have seemed increasingly untenable. The logic of survival shifts under conquest. What once signified prestige may become exposure. What once required loyalty may become silence. One should resist the temptation to imagine a single ceremonial departure, the inhabitants descending one last time in solemn awareness that the city would never again be used. History is usually more uneven than that. Some structures may have fallen quiet before others. Some residents may have left earlier. A smaller caretaker presence may have persisted for a period after elite occupation declined. Knowledge of the place likely continued in surrounding communities, even as formal use narrowed or stopped. Abandonment is often a process of thinning until the remaining life no longer sustains the whole. The mountain environment would then have accelerated the transition from use to stillness. Without regular maintenance, vegetation begins its patient work. Channels clog, paths soften, roofs fail if not renewed. Organic materials disappear first, leaving stone to carry the memory of vanished interiors. Moss gathers, soil shifts, roots test joints. None of this happens instantly. But in cloud forest conditions, it happens with persistence. A city does not need to be destroyed to become hard to read. It only needs to be left alone long enough for weather and growth to blur its human patterns. There is a melancholy dignity in this kind of ending. Machu Picchu was not reduced to a spectacle of total ruin in the immediate aftermath of imperial collapse. Instead, it seems to have entered the mountain gradually, as if the ridge began to close around it once the human order had weakened. The terraces remained, the sacred stones remained, the spring continued to flow, but the city's social temperature fell. The sounds that had once defined it, footsteps, voices, vessels at the fountains, labor on the slopes, ritual movement through thresholds, thinned into absence. And still, abandonment does not mean meaninglessness. A place can cease to function in its original way while continuing to matter in other ways. Local knowledge may persist, memory may survive in altered forms. The land may continue to bear witness, even when archives fall silent. This is especially true in the Andes, where sacred geography has often outlasted political systems. Machu Picchu may have ceased to be an active imperial center, but it did not become nothing. The mountain kept it. The valley kept it. The surrounding world did not forget it in the absolute sense, even as global history remained largely unaware. So the question of abandonment leads us not to one dramatic answer, but to a field of interlocking causes: political fracture, epidemic damage, logistical decline, shifting sacred meaning, colonial transformation, environmental reclaiming. All likely played their part. The city was too specialized, too symbolically charged, and too dependent on wider coherence to survive unchanged once the Inca world entered its terminal crisis. That is what gives Machu Picchu's silence its particular poignancy. It was not abandoned because it had no value. It was abandoned because the kind of value it embodied became harder and harder to sustain in a shattered world. The mountain city did not fail on its own terms. History moved around it, against it, and beyond it. And in the end, the terraces remained to hold the slope, the fountains remained to remember water, and the granite remained to keep the shape of human intention long after the intention itself had departed. Once the people had thinned from Machu Picchu, the mountain began its long, patient work of return. Not return in the sentimental sense, as though nature were kindly reclaiming an abandoned dream, but return in the stern and methodical language of cloud forest ecology. A city on a ridge does not remain unchanged when human hands withdraw. Stone may endure, but stone alone is not a city. Roofs require renewal, channels require clearing, paths require feet, terraces require tending. Once that living maintenance ceases, every surface becomes vulnerable to the slow persistence of water, root, moss, and gravity. Machu Picchu did not vanish in a moment. It was folded back into the mountain by increments. This folding is one of the most beautiful and most deceptive phases in the life of any ruin. To modernize, vegetation often appears romantic. Vines over walls, moss on steps, trees leaning above silent stone. These forms seem to soften the harsher fact of abandonment. But for the ruin itself, plant life is never purely decorative. It is pressure. It is moisture retention. It is roots entering joints, seeds settling in cracks, organic matter gathering where once there was clean stone and controlled movement. In the wet world of Machu Picchu, such processes would have begun quickly and continued relentlessly. The cloud forest is especially well suited to this work. Moist air hangs close to surfaces. Mist condenses and lingers. Rain nourishes not only grasses and shrubs, but a dense community of mosses, lichens, ferns, orchids, and creeping growth that thrive on stone and in every pocket of trapped sediment. On a maintained site, these can be managed. On an abandoned one, they become agents of transformation. A stairway begins to blur at the edges. A wall line softens. A terrace drains less efficiently. A path that once carried disciplined movement becomes uncertain beneath wet growth. What the Inca had made crisp and legible, the mountain begins to render soft and partial. Roofs were likely among the first major losses. At Machu Picchu, as in much of the Andean world, the surviving stone walls are only part of the original architecture. Organic superstructures once completed the buildings, giving them enclosure, warmth, shadow, and practical use. These elements do not endure like granite, without regular replacement and care. Roofing materials rot, shift, or are torn apart by weather. Once roofs fail, interiors are exposed more fully to rain, temperature change, and invasive growth. Walls may remain standing, but the rooms they once defined become altered environments, no longer protected from the mountain's broader climate. This change would have transformed the emotional atmosphere of the city as much as its physical one. A roofless room is not merely a damaged room. It has lost a way of being inhabited. Sound changes within it. Light enters differently. Rain falls where it was once kept out. Cold settles more sharply at night. Sacred thresholds lose some of their control over experience. Domestic spaces lose privacy. The city's inward life begins to leak away. Long before the walls crumble, habitability itself has already been compromised. The water system, too, would have entered a new phase. Springs continue to flow, but human guidance matters. Channels clog when leaves, sediment, and root matter accumulate. Carefully balanced runoff patterns begin to shift. Water that once moved gracefully through planned routes may start to spill elsewhere, undercutting edges or encouraging saturation in vulnerable places. The terraces, so brilliantly designed to manage moisture, remain resilient for a long time, but they were never intended to function forever without watchfulness. Their hidden layers do tremendous work, yet even the finest terrace needs a culture of maintenance around it. Abandonment turns engineering into inheritance without guardians, and still, Machu Picchu endured better than many sites because its underlying design was so intelligent. This is one of the great ironies of its afterlife. The city could survive being left alone only because it had been built with such deep understanding of slope, drainage, stone, and weather. A weaker settlement would have collapsed into incoherence far sooner. Machu Picchu did not. It held its form even as the forest entered it. The terraces continued to brace the ridge. The walls kept their lines. The sacred stones still rose from the mountain with authority. The city became obscured, but not erased. Obscurity is a different condition from ruin. A place can be hidden in plain reality, softened and fragmented until only a patient eye sees the whole. That is what the forest did to Machu Picchu. It did not devour the city in some dramatic act. It distributed concealment unevenly. Here, a wall might remain visible. There, a stairway might disappear under growth. One terrace line might still read clearly at a distance, while another dissolved into the slope. The city became a puzzle of survivals, legible only in parts unless one moved through it with time and attention. This partial concealment may have contributed greatly to its later reputation as a place out of time. The mountain had not erased the architecture, but it had made architecture harder to see as system. Animals, too, would have changed the feel of the site. Birds nesting in sheltered ledges, insects thriving in damp corners, small creatures moving along paths no longer governed by human schedules. The soundscape of the city would have shifted from human routine to ecological continuity, where once there were footsteps on stone, voices at fountains, and the controlled rhythms of work. There would now be wind, rain, bird calls, and the softer rustle of vegetation in motion. The city's silence was never total. It was repopulated by non-human life. There is a strange dignity in this phase. Machu Picchu was not smashed into formlessness. It entered another kind of life, one in which the mountain ceased to be a setting for imperial order and became again the dominant author of daily conditions. Yet the Inca imprint remained visible enough to resist total absorption. This is what gives the site its haunting quality even now. It belongs both to human design and to natural persistence. Neither fully cancels the other. The walls still declare intention. The forest still declares time. Perhaps this is also why the city retained such power when outsiders later encountered it again. Had Machu Picchu remained perfectly open and fully preserved, it would have impressed through clarity alone. Had it collapsed entirely, it might have become only an archaeological trace. Instead, it survived in a state between revelation and concealment. The walls were there, but softened by growth. The terraces held, but were draped with green. The sacred ridge remained unmistakable, yet wrapped in cloud, moss, and silence. The forest did not merely hide the city. It gave the city a second visual identity, one of stillness, endurance, and suspended memory. In that long interval, the mountain resumed authority over pace. Seasons passed. Rains came and went. New plants rooted where old pathways had once been swept clean. Mist entered rooms that no longer had roofs. Light changed across stones no one was there to watch. The city stopped functioning as the Inca had intended, but it did not stop existing as presence. It stood above the Urubamba, no longer maintained by state labor, yet still held together by the force of its own design. Silence deepened, but shape remained. So when we imagine Machu Picchu after abandonment, we should not picture a dead shell waiting passively for rediscovery. We should picture a city entering a new relationship with the mountain. Human order withdrew. Ecological order advanced. Granite kept faith with engineering while moss and root began their quiet revisions. The forest took the walls, but only partly. It covered them, softened them, inhabited them, and taught them another kind of patience. And in that patience, high above the river bend, Machu Picchu survived its own disappearance, becoming not only an abandoned city, but a hidden one, held in green silence until new eyes learned how to see it again. For much of the modern age, Machu Picchu has existed in two realities at once. One is the ancient city itself, built of granite, water, slope, and sky. The other is the scientific city, the Machu Picchu reconstructed through excavation trenches, survey grids, radiocarbon samples, architectural comparison, hydrological analysis, and increasingly precise digital mapping. These two realities do not compete. They enrich one another. The first gives us wonder. The second gives us disciplined wonder, sharpened by evidence, patient enough to accept uncertainty, and humble enough to admit how much still remains hidden. The scientific study of Machu Picchu has never been a single event. It has unfolded over generations, each returning to the ridge with new questions and better tools. Early investigations cleared vegetation, mapped structures, removed debris, and attempted first identifications. Those efforts were incomplete and sometimes shaped by the assumptions of their era, yet they opened the city to sustained inquiry. Later, archaeologists worked more carefully through context, understanding that a site is not only its visible walls, but also the layers of use, discard, repair, and abandonment preserved in soil and feature relationships. Stratigraphic excavation became crucial here. The order in which layers appear, the materials associated with them, and the contexts in which artifacts are found all help reveal how the city changed over time. This is a slow kind of revelation. Archaeology rarely rewards impatience. A dramatic wall may seize immediate attention, but the quieter details often change interpretation more deeply. A deposit of broken ceramics in one area may suggest activity patterns. A burial context may alter assumptions about who lived here and from where they came. A retaining wall foundation may show construction stages not obvious from the surface. The scientific city is built from such incremental gains. It is an act of listening to small things until the larger place speaks more clearly. Radiocarbon dating has played an especially important role in refining the chronology of Machu Picchu. For a long time, the occupation of the site was framed largely through historical inference and stylistic comparison. Those methods remain valuable, but direct dating from organic remains has helped narrow the time frame more securely. The results suggest that Machu Picchu may have come into use somewhat earlier than some older models assumed, placing it firmly within the period of strong imperial development under Pachacuti and his successors. Chronology matters because it anchors the city in lived historical processes rather than in vague antiquity. It allows us to see Machu Picchu not as a timeless marvel suspended outside history, but as a deliberate creation of a particular imperial moment. Architectural analysis has also transformed understanding. Careful comparison of wall styles, building techniques, spatial organization, and ceremonial forms helps distinguish different sectors of the city and the varying levels of labor invested in them. It reveals the hierarchy of spaces. It clarifies which areas were meant to impress, which were designed for residence, which managed slope and water, and which concentrated sacred meaning. The more closely researchers study the city's forms, the more evident it becomes that Machu Picchu was not simply assembled according to one generic plan. It was thought through as an integrated mountain environment. Hydrological research has been equally revealing. It is one thing to admire the fountains and terraces. It is another to understand the calculations and empirical intelligence that made them function. Scientific study of the spring source, channel gradients, drainage layers, and runoff behavior has shown how deeply water management shaped every major decision at the site. This is not decorative sophistication. It is survival engineering in a wet and unstable mountain setting. Such work also helps explain why the city endured abandonment better than many other places. Its hidden systems were as intelligent as its visible ones. Conservation science now adds another layer to the story. To study Machu Picchu is also to preserve it, and preservation in a site like this is a profoundly difficult task. Too little intervention invites erosion, slippage, biological damage, and overcrowding pressures. Too much intervention risks distorting the original fabric of the place or imposing modern neatness where historical complexity belongs. Conservators must think like archaeologists, engineers, ecologists, and historians all at once. They must manage vegetation without pretending the mountain can be sterilized. They must stabilize structures without turning the city into a dead museum object. They must protect paths while understanding that movement itself is part of how the site has always been experienced. Digital mapping and remote sensing have extended the scientific city even further. Detailed topographic models, three-dimensional scans, drone imagery, and spatial analysis now allow researchers to study the relation between structures, slopes, drainage, and surrounding landscape with unprecedented precision. The ridge can be examined not just as isolated ruins, but as a dynamic terrain system. Patterns invisible from ground level become legible from above. Distances, alignments, and construction relationships can be measured with far greater subtlety. Yet even these advanced tools do not diminish the mystery of Machu Picchu. They refine it. The more exact our image becomes, the more striking it is that such a place was conceived and realized without modern machines. One of the most important gifts of science is that it can correct romance without destroying wonder. Machu Picchu does not need fantasy to remain astonishing. In fact, the real story is stronger than fantasy. The city was built by human beings working within the known constraints of Inca technology, labor organization, sacred thought, and environmental knowledge. No lost race is needed, no impossible machinery, no myth of superhuman outsiders. The truth is harder, nobler, and more beautiful. Ancient people, our intellectual equals, looked at a fractured mountain ridge and understood how to shape it into a city that could manage water, hold soil, express hierarchy, align with sacred topography, and endure centuries of silence. And yet science also teaches restraint. It does not solve every question. It cannot restore the full emotional texture of the people who moved here. It cannot tell us with perfect confidence every ritual spoken, every political decision made, every final departure felt in the chest of those who left. Data narrows possibility, but some possibilities remain. This is where the best scholarship becomes almost philosophical. It knows the value of evidence. It also knows the dignity of unanswered questions. For the most part, secrets remain hidden, not because the site resists study absolutely, but because human worlds are always richer than what material traces alone can fully preserve. The modern scientific attention given to Machu Picchu has also changed the site itself. Excavation reveals and sometimes disturbs. Tourism protects through value and threatens through volume. Conservation preserves and interprets, but it also inevitably shapes how the city is seen. Every generation receives not the untouched Machu Picchu of the 15th century, but a Machu Picchu already filtered through clearing, repair, management, and scholarly framing. This does not invalidate the experience of the site. It simply reminds us that the city now lives in dialogue with modern institutions, as well as with ancient stones. There is something fitting in that. Machu Picchu was always a place of layered meanings. It was imperial and sacred, practical and symbolic, exposed and hidden. Now it is also archaeological and global, protected and vulnerable, studied and still only partly understood. The scientific city grows around the ancient one like an invisible second architecture made of measurements, dates, diagrams, reports, and debates. This second city does not replace the first. It helps us approach it more honestly. So, when we look upon Machu Picchu today, we are seeing not only the work of Inca builders, but the patient work of those who have tried to understand them. Trenches cut into soil, samples taken for dating, stone-by-stone surveys, careful conservation of walls and terraces, digital reconstructions of slope and space. All of this has brought the mountain city closer without exhausting it. That may be the deepest lesson of all. True knowledge does not flatten the world. It gives shape to wonder while allowing wonder to remain. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. More hidden contexts may yet emerge. New methods may refine old debates. Unknown features may be recognized in the surrounding landscape. But even now, Machu Picchu stands as one of the rare places where science and awe strengthen one another. The city still keeps some of its silence. The researchers keep returning. Between them, high above the Urubamba, a long conversation continues. And in that conversation, the ancient mountain city remains not solved, but gloriously, dignifiedly alive. In the end, Machu Picchu leaves us with a feeling rarer than explanation. It does not merely impress, it reorders the mind. So many ancient places survive as fragments of former greatness, enough to inspire admiration, but not always enough to change the scale of our thoughts. Machu Picchu does something different. It stands high above the Urubamba in such perfect tension with its mountain setting that it forces us to reconsider what human beings are capable of when labor, belief, intelligence, and landscape are joined into one disciplined act. The city remains because the Inca did not build lightly, and because the mountain, though severe, has allowed their intention to keep speaking. That speech is not loud. Machu Picchu does not shout through colossal size or endless inscription. Its authority is quieter than that. It lies in the measured fall of terraces, in the calm exactness of fitted granite, in the way water still remembers its channels, in the way the ridge still seems to hold architecture and cloud in one breath. The city teaches through restraint. It reminds us that greatness does not always take the form of excess. Sometimes it takes the form of rightness, of a place made so well, so thoughtfully, and with such intimate understanding of its setting that centuries of abandonment cannot erase its coherence. This is part of what makes Machu Picchu feel philosophical as much as historical. We are not only looking at what the Inca built, we are looking at what they believed a human life should be in relation to the world, not separate from mountain, sky, water, and season, but woven through them, not detached from sacred order, but accountable to it, not content with crude survival, but committed to shaping difficult beauty out of difficult conditions. There is dignity in that vision. The people who made this city were not primitive dreamers reaching blindly upward. They were disciplined thinkers of stone, slope, and ritual time. They studied their world carefully, then answered it with form. Machu Picchu also endures because it refuses a narrow moral lesson. It is not simply a tale of triumph. The city was born from empire. An empire always carries burdens as well as achievements. Labor was organized, commanded, and extracted. Hierarchy was written into walls, paths, and access. The beauty of the site does not erase the cost of sustaining it, nor should we let wonder become innocence. Ancient sophistication does not mean ancient gentleness. The same power that could create a sacred ridge city could also demand obedience from communities spread across hard landscapes. To honor the Inca honestly is to hold both truths together, their intelligence and their authority, their elegance and their discipline. Yet even with that complexity, the city's legacy remains profoundly human. Machu Picchu speaks across centuries because it preserves an ambition recognizable in every age, the desire to make meaning endure, the desire to build not only for use, but for memory, the desire to place human order within something larger than the self. In the modern world, so much of what we make is temporary by design. Materials decay quickly. Structures are replaced before they are understood. Landscapes are flattened rather than interpreted. Machu Picchu stands as a counter-argument. It says that endurance begins in attention. It says that to build well is to listen before imposing. It says that the earth is not merely occupied, but read. There is also a special poignancy in the city's afterlife. It was abandoned, though not forgotten, absolutely. It was hidden. Though never erased, it was studied, yet never fully solved. This gives it a double legacy. Machu Picchu belongs both to the Inca who made it and to the generations who have looked upon it with wonder, question, and care. Each era has found its own reflection there. For some, it has been proof of lost grandeur. For others, a national symbol. For archaeologists, a field of evidence and argument. For travelers, a moment of awe difficult to translate into ordinary language. For all, perhaps, it has been a reminder that history is not dead matter. It waits in certain places with unsettling vitality. And what of our place in that long road of human history? That may be the deepest question the city leaves behind. We like to imagine ourselves as uniquely advanced, uniquely rational, uniquely capable of mastering environment through knowledge. Machu Picchu gently unsettles that pride. It shows us a civilization without modern machinery, creating a settlement of astonishing precision in one of the most difficult landscapes imaginable. It shows us water managed with grace, slopes stabilized with patience, sacred space composed with confidence, and architecture joined to topography with a sensitivity many modern builders still fail to achieve. The lesson is not that the past was better. It is that the past was fully human, and that human intelligence has always taken forms richer than our own age sometimes allows. At the same time, Machu Picchu warns against arrogance in another direction. No achievement, however refined, stands beyond history. The city was magnificent, but it was not immune to imperial fracture, disease, conquest, or the slow withdrawal of sustaining systems. Its stones endured better than its political world. This, too, is part of its meaning. We are reminded that civilizations are not guaranteed permanence by brilliance alone. They survive through webs of care, legitimacy, labor, and adaptation. When those webs break, even the most extraordinary places can fall silent. That is a sober lesson, and perhaps a necessary one. Still, silence is not the same as defeat. Machu Picchu was left behind, but it did not surrender its form. It entered the mountain, waded through rain and root and cloud, and emerged again into broader human sight with much of its dignity intact. There is something deeply consoling in that. It suggests that meaning can outlast interruption, that beauty, once made with enough care, can survive periods of neglect, that human thought, set into stone with sufficient understanding, may continue speaking long after the voices that first shaped it have disappeared. So perhaps the legacy of Machu Picchu is not simply that it should not exist, but that it continues to ask us how we wish to exist. Will we build carelessly or attentively? Will we treat landscapes as obstacles to be crushed, or as presences to be understood? Will we imagine the past as crude and childish, or will we recognize our ancestors as companions in intelligence, uncertainty, faith, and ambition? Will we value only what is immediate, or can we still make things meant to converse with time? High on its ridge, surrounded by peaks and moving cloud, the city does not answer these questions for us. It simply holds them. The terraces still descend with patient rhythm. The sacred stones still face the sky. The mountain still bears the memory of human effort made exact. And there, in that union of endurance and silence, Machu Picchu leaves its final gift. It reminds us that history is not a pile of dead centuries behind us. It is a living measure of what human beings have dared, built, lost, and remembered. The city remains, not as a miracle outside history, but as one of history's most beautiful proofs that people, when guided by discipline and vision, can shape even the most improbable places into lasting thought. And when night settles, as it always does, over the ridges and the river below, Machu Picchu still seems to wait in the darkness with the patience of stone, asking us to look upward, to look backward, and to think more humbly about our place beneath the same enduring sky.